And to that piece of lieutenant that's always on his podcast, bashing us, him.
Attention to roll call.
That's right. Good morning, everybody. 8:05 live Eastern Time. We got a great episode. We're going to interview and have a guest here, David Viola. Very interesting character, an impressive record, impressive resume. David Viola is actually the author to a book called You Have Entered the Storm. He's also a member of the U.S. Navy. David Viola is also a professor at John Jay College. Dives into terrorism. So, David, you have an impressive record. It's a laundry list of valor, and I'm quite impressed, and I think everyone's going to be impressed with you today. So let's just jump right into it. Let's warm the our guest and our fans and our friends and our haters, and let's get to know you. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and eventually we can get into it. So just tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what inspired you to have such an impressive resume.
Hey, thank you, Eric, and thank you, John. Thank you guys for having me on today, and thanks for all the listeners and watchers for joining us today. So I think you covered a lot of it. So I think most recently, my book, You Have Unleashed a Storm, came out in April, covering political violence and terrorism and the response to terrorism in New York City by NYPD and by the Bureau, by FBI back in the 60s and 70s. I am also a Navy veteran, spent most of my time with the Naval Special Warfare community as an intel officer. A lot of stuff can't talk about there, obviously. And, I'm a native New Yorker. Born and raised in the city, grew up mostly uptown on the east side on 97th Street. Went to school on the east side, went to humanities down in Chelsea for high school. My family's been in the city, mostly in Brooklyn, since the 1860s. So, pretty old school. My brother just retired from the fire department on the west side. So we're through and through New Yorkers, and half of my friends went to PD, and the other half, including my brother, went to fire department. So this is home for me, and I appreciate it. So I think a lot of what we're talking about today, in terms of looking at political violence, a lot of what I have looked at, comes from being like one of my earliest memories as a young adult, as a kid, was the 1993 bombing at the World Trade Center. I was still in school, junior high school, and literally having friends who panicking because their parents worked at the Trade Center, and this is before you can pick up your phone and text your mom and dad or something, panicking, trying to find out what's going on. And then being just a few years later, my very first job, my very first year out of university, was on Chambers Street and West Broadway, about 2 blocks from the Trade Center. And being down there on 9/11, my brother was just in the academy coming out, but knew everyone up at his firehouse up on the Upper West Side. And, nobody went home that day from his firehouse. The truck and the engine, nobody went home. And these are all, people that he'd already gotten to know, because he's already detailed to the truck company coming out of the academy. So, it's, it was very present in my mind as a very young person growing up. What was this crap that's happening to us, and where is it coming from? And then move forward, and I had a career in entertainment, and then when I went into government and all the other things I've done, really starting to focus on what is this terrorism thing and what is the history of it. Looking back into New York, eventually I did my PhD in history, and I focused on exploring that exact question. Prior to my experience, prior to 93, prior to September 11th of 2001, what is this history of political violence and terrorism in New York? And there's a lot. Terrorism in New York did not start in 1993. It didn't start in 2001. And it didn't end there, unfortunately, right? We look at everything that's happening today, and it's, what's old is new again, right? Unfortunately. And I think that brings us up to what we're chatting about today.
So let me ask you. You work at the Center for Terrorism at John Jay, and obviously you have a great interest in it, right? You said you were exposed to it at a young age. I think we're all about the same age, so I remember specifically both those times. I even then go further. I go into the academy, and I remember a detective And it's something that stuck with me, telling me don't ever kick anything, because he tells about a bombing that happened where he just walked over and he's like, this is bullshit. Goes over and kicks a bomb and explodes it. And I never really pushed back onto the further back portion of history of terrorism, domestic terrorism, political violence in the 60s and 70s. What do you think really drove you to like take a great interest in that? Did you see similarities with things that were happening from then to now? Like, how did it specifically happen around that time? Like, what was it that you think drove you?
You know, for me, it was like, so coming up on as I'm doing my PhD, and I just started teaching at John Jay at that time, just adjuncting a class here and a class there. You know, go John Jay, by the way. We probably got a lot of John Jay alum out there. So for me, a lot of it was, you know, looking back over the long history. You have to think these really big ticket items back in like 1914 and 1920, like 1920 specifically, when anarchists bombed the JP Morgan Bank down on Wall Street. You can go down that building and you can still see the shrapnel marks on the outside of the building. You know, big marble facade, and especially as the sun is going down in the west, it casts a shadow right across the facade, and you can see the shrapnel marks from this bombing. You know, 38 New Yorkers died that day. It's a big effing deal. One of my primary advisors, Beverly Gage, a remarkable historian up at Yale who just won the Pulitzer Prize for her book on J. Edgar Hoover. She literally wrote the book on the 1920 Wall Street bombing. And that to me was like, I see 1920, I see 1993 and 2001. There's this big chunk in the middle that we're not talking about. What happened then? Did nothing happen there? And that's why nobody's talking about it. So while I was doing research for my PhD, I started looking into it. And the reality is that there's a lot that happened in that period, and we just had not talked about it. You know, there was Mad Bomber George Metesky during like the 1940s and into the 1950s who, you know, small bombs, former Marine, nothing against Marines. You know, he'd bombed a bunch of things just in protest of Con Ed for what Con Ed had done to him while he was a worker there. You know, there's a bombing at the World Fair in 1942, I think. What killed a couple of members of service. 2 detectives, I think, died there in that bombing. And then really into the 1960s, it just becomes to like, when I look at it from like a metric standpoint, in the late 1960s into like 1970, there were more bombings by a wider variety of political actors in New York than literally anywhere else on the planet in the modern world. You know, because you know, you got a lot of bombings someplace by, I don't know, by the IRA during the Troubles or whatever it might be. It's one kind of an actor. In like 1969, and I kept pulling these layers back, expecting to like find the bottom of the barrel, and I didn't. Every layer I pulled back, there was more and more and more violence. You know, there's other kinds of political violence on top of bombings, but just bombings alone, there were, you know, the Jewish Defense League, like the Weather Underground and other radical leftists. There was the Minutemen and other radical right-wing actors. There was Cuban Power, Cuban exiles, you know, bombing Castro. There was Croatian nationalists. There were Puerto Rican nationalists. Everywhere I went, there was more of these guys blowing up things. Some days there'd be 2 or 3 bombings on like page 8, page 14, page 20 in the Daily News, just because I couldn't keep track, you know? So for me, it was like really trying to understand how that played into what we all do, you know, working on this side of the line, in PD, in the military, in intelligence, in the fire department, you know, and there's a tremendous amount of history there that I wanted to try and help understand. And the police department that existed in '93 and the counterterrorism efforts that it had, and the FBI that existed in '93 and then in 2001 are direct results of the violence that happened in the 60s and 70s. The Joint Terrorism Task Force comes out of New York in what happened in the 60s and 70s. So for me, it was just about trying to understand why all 3 of us made the career and life choices that we made. And a lot of it's because of what happened back then.
In this short time of talking to you, I already learned about your humility, because you have so many accolades. I didn't even want to mention them all, so I figured you would actually get into it. You were humble, and you kind of glazed over the fact that you were also a filmmaker. You just said you were in entertainment. And David, in addition to that, served in the Navy, and I know you couldn't go into everything, but you have so many accolades. It's really impressive. But you also hold a doctorate, so super impressive in history. And I actually have a bachelor's in history, so we have some similarities here. So it's interesting. You talk about going into the 60s in comparison till now, and a lot of it is foundation of why we police in a manner when you talk about Joint Terrorist Task Force. So if you can then, based on your book, your experience in real life, and of course, as a college professor, how do you define, right? Because I think we pretty much understand it, but how do you define political violence in comparison, right? Because we're both in the service, which is why I want to mention it, right? How do we compare that to crime, as far as how the police see it, war,
Yeah.
and how does that compare to political violence?
Totally. So, I think it's a great question. Thanks, man. And I don't want to get too eggheady professory, so please stop me anytime I go in that direction. But I think
Dave, just before you go, bro, don't get too close to your mic for whatever reason. When you lean in, it bladders up. So just wherever you were sitting, just stay.
I'm just gonna go and do that then. Try and.
Oh, it must be when you're moving, dude. It must be when you're moving.
It sounds like a whoopee cushion.
Yeah, whenever you move forward, you blare out. So
how's that? Is that better?
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Just give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down whenever I'm doing it again.
Actually, usually Ballin has the mics.
Bring it up a little. It's your movement. Bring it up a little. It's when you move. Just be cognizant when you move. It messes up a little bit.
Yep, will do. I'm just gonna do that. Put on the outside. That's gonna be
usually Ballin has the mic issue, so you replaced him today.
That's it. Yeah. They said Mullen looks different today. So.
Yeah, we like
the violence.
If that's not better, just give me a thumbs down or something. And I apologize to everyone who's been hearing that.
No, don't worry about it.
Next thing you know, my cat's gonna jump in my lap and really be a pain in the ass. But yeah, so I think that when you look at a lot of the crime that you guys would have investigated in uniform, a lot of that's driven by personal gain, right? Like you're not looking to make a political statement. Somebody's looking to whatever. They need a new car radio. They're trying to sell some drugs, or it's a personal vendetta against somebody else for whatever beef they got, right? Political violence is driven by an ideology. You're not looking necessarily for your own gain. You're looking for what you perceive to be a gain for the greater good, which is crazy. This needs, even like Al-Qaeda terrorists, they thought that they were doing something. They believed that they were doing something for the greater good of Islam or humanity or however they defined it. So political violence is simply that. It's violence that's driven by a political objective or political ideology. And, terrorism is one kind of political violence. It's usually meant to be a message that you're projecting to somebody else. But there's other kinds of political violence too. Riots are political violence if they're driven by a political objective. Assassinations, like the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, that's political violence. You don't have to be a politician to be the victim of political violence. So assassinations as well, and we see a lot of that. In the 1960s, you had riots that were driven by political, by political objectives. You had violence that was riots. You definitely had terrorism. You had a lot of bombings. And unfortunately, you also had a lot of assassinations in the 60s and 70s. I think that what's a little bit different these days is that, in the 60s and the 70s, you had the long list of tragic assassinations from, kicking off with JFK. And then within a half of a decade, which is mind-boggling to think about how fast things move, you go from JFK to Medgar Evers to Malcolm X to Martin Luther King to Robert Kennedy. Just, you're reeling off these names. It's all in a half a century. The bullets were flying everywhere, and they're all politically driven. Back in the 60s and 70s, though, it was all prominent people on the American left who were getting assassinated. That's not the case right now, right? You have people on the left getting assassinated, like happened in Minnesota. Then you have very prominent people on the American right, like Charlie Kirk, getting assassinated, and two different people taking shots at President Trump. So so there are comparisons to be made to the 60s, but it's also different and maybe even scarier.
So, in the 60s, we didn't have social media. We didn't have the split-second news cycle where everything's being reported, information's flowing at us. what was the political climate like though at that time, 60s and 70s? Is it similar to in your opinion, is it similar to the political climate that we have today, where there's a large divide between Republicans, Democrats, or who you consider on the right and on the left? Was there a large political gap? Like, are there any similarities in the rhetoric? Is basically what I'm asking.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities. I actually think that to some degree we're worse off now, and it's even scarier now. When you think back to the 60s and 70s, you had these like big ticket events and items that drove the political schism that bifurcated Americans. A lot of it was the Vietnam War. A lot of it was the Civil Rights Movement. You had a lot of violence being targeting the Civil Rights Movement. There's so many bombings in Birmingham to counter the Civil Rights Movement that people in Birmingham started calling it Bombingham. So the Civil Rights Movement drove a lot of violence, not because the civil rights actors were engaging it, but a lot of reactionary violence, like the fire bombings of the Freedom Rider buses, Bull Connor and all that stuff down in Selma. So there's a lot of political violence driven by civil rights movement. And then the anti-war movement, the anti-war movement was tremendously peaceful by and large, but on the fringes of it, you had guys and gals like the Weather Underground blowing up stuff all over the country. So I think that once the civil rights movement kind of tapered off, one, because of, the assassination of so many of its leaders, and two, because of, the emergence of like the Black Panthers and I think there was a big degree of like mass support, like of general American support for civil rights movement tapering off once it became the Black Power movement. But civil rights does taper off, so that cools the temperature a little bit. And look, once Nixon is out of office and once the Vietnam War is over, a lot of that sentiment kind of dissipates and disappears also. So those are big reasons why the political violence in the 60s and 70s kind of cooled down, right? Because the things that ignited the fire kind of went away for better or worse, and now I think, and look, back in the 60s and 70s, you had anti-war Republicans. You had people like John Lindsay, here in New York, so it wasn't quite as partisan as it is now. Now, I don't know what the underlying cause is, other than that half of America sees a dramatically different version of America than the other half, and I don't know how we overcome that, to be perfectly honest. But thankfully, no one's relying on me for the solutions. I'm just identifying like that's the problem we got.
I'm fascinated that everything comes full circle, right? You have a doctorate in history, but having a bachelor's in history, I understand how things do come full circle. And one thing I learned in history, they say the best prediction of the future is a reflection of the past. And that's why it's important to study history. And what you identified is different groups that were back then, right? Predominantly the Black Panthers, right? You had the Black Liberation Army. And what we see now that's so prevalent, I think, is not just these organized groups, but identity politics. So what I mean by that is, what role do you think identity in today's day plays in political violence? Does that play a role? For instance, because we see this is left or this is right. So what role does people identify? We have all these trans movements, these different LGBTQ movements. What role does identity play in this political violence?
Yeah, I think that question is, it's sad, right? That is so true. You're right. It's not just who you identify as, it's also how you identify the other, right? And then who is your enemy now? And are they now, if you identify some other and you kind of make them less than what you are, it makes it a lot easier to resort to violence against them. A lot of people on the fringes of both sides of this political divide, stupid lefty libtards, I don't care if I punch them in the face, or like stupid fascist, I don't care if I shoot them in the head on a college campus, so it's not just who you identify with, it's also how you identify the other. And we've really fallen into these foxholes now, right? Like Democrats straight up won't go to dinner parties or date Republicans and vice versa. It's become really scary. And it's not just on the political divide. Like I think like on the left and right, you kind of bucket them, right? Like on the right, you have people who are like in the 2A camp. On the left, you have people who are perhaps more supportive of LGBTQ rights. So like we're falling into these foxholes, and even in those right and left foxholes, we have like subcompartments, which just makes it that chasm in the middle even wider and wider. And yeah, it makes it really easy to sort of like to other the your adversaries and to kind of dehumanize them a little bit. Once you dehumanize people, it makes it much easier to perform violence on them, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it's a crazy time, man. I was looking at videos before we went on today when I was making coffee, and it was people popping Tylenols, pregnant women popping, because now Tylenol's an issue. We're fighting over Tylenol. Like it's crazy, It's like whether you agree with the president or not. I mean, do you have to go out and virtue signal it? Like it's just such a weird time that we're living in, where everyone wants to vocalize their opinion. So Dave, let me ask you. So obviously, police, law enforcement, intelligence, all that stuff has evolved over time, right? And I think we could all sit there and say that, like, not only has it evolved, but some of our rights as Americans have eroded as a result of that. And I think that's a longer discussion for a different question. But what was the law enforcement ethos at that time, at the height of these bombings in New York City in history? And like, what was the NYPD and the FBI doing to try to contain these? And was there a push on American civil rights as well? Was there like an encroachment on the Constitution as well? Like, how did we police terrorism, basically, is what I'm asking then.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question, and that whole question, I think, is at the heart of what I looked at for a long time. So starting way back in the World War II era, NYPD had started up. Actually, I'm sorry, in the World War I era, NYPD had started up what became like various like intelligence and like counter radical units. You have the Red Squad, you have the Italian Squad, even the Bomb Squad did like political investigations back when it first started out 100 years ago, before coming like basically the NYPD's version of EOD, of explosive ordnance, right? So by the 1950s, all that had come together as a Bureau of Special Services and Investigations, BOSSI, which was like the political intelligence unit at NYPD. And by everything, all the research that I've been able to do, the largest and most capable non-federal intelligence outfit in American history. These were real capable guys and gals working at BOSSI. And inside of the detective division, they were kind of their own little fiefdom, right? Like, didn't really report to anyone outside of detective division, and liaised greatly with aspects of the federal government, with the FBI, with the CIA, and they were responsible for all these kind of investigations. Back then, it was mostly like counter-communist or anti-communist investigations. So you think about what we know the FBI was doing back then, these pretty invasive investigations of people on the American left, for better or worse, because it was era of communism, like the American Communist, like Social Workers Party, all these organizations. NYPD had kind of similar investigations of them, sending people out into the field without uniforms, often without badges, without even carrying badges, to do these investigations, unfortunately without warrants. But I'm not casting blame. That's exactly the same way that the entire federal government was doing it at the time. But NYPD and BOSSI were doing it similarly. By the time the bombs start going off, NYPD has got they have either informants or undercovers out in a lot of these movements. They have informants and undercovers within the anti-war movement, and NYPD helps to break up a Weather Underground cell. But frankly, the FBI had a grand total of one informant inside of Weather Underground for the entirety of its time, which is exactly how many informants NYPD had in it. But you look at, NYPD's got a small jurisdiction. Hoover was supposed to have been covering the whole country and massively failed when it came to like countering the Weather Underground. And a lot of that did come at the expense of civil liberties. a lot of us, we looked at like what became the Panther 13 case, the Panther 21 case. And for a lot of people who aren't familiar with that, that is when Bossy in 1969 had spearheaded an investigation into the Black Panthers in New York, alleging a pretty widespread campaign of plots to bomb everything from like the Botanic Gardens to, to movie theaters and whatnot. And it resulted in what was then in 1970 and 71, the longest and most expensive trial in New York City history, and resulted in every single one of the Panthers being found not guilty on every single one of the charges. And most of what the jury said was like, hey, listen, we know these guys were up to something, but there is so much more outraged at what Bossy was doing in terms of invasion of civil liberties that they found them all guilty. And instead it turned into sort of like criticism of Bossy, and that Panther 13 case turns into the Handshoot case, which is a class action lawsuit filed against Bossy and the police department, alleging a lot of this stuff. And the Handshoe decree ends up really taking Bossy and reducing his capabilities down way far in the 1970s.
Could you just explain to the audience what Handshoe is? Because I think a lot of the younger cops don't even know that. So if you could just delve into Handshoe a little too.
100%. So Handshoe decree was, or the Handshoe class action lawsuit was a lawsuit alleging massive amounts of violations of civil liberties and political activity, nonviolent political activity by the city, mostly through Bossy on the American left, or on leftist movements in New York. And this is when I think Leary was commissioner, and in terms of like warrantless wiretaps, invasion of political groups, invasion of freedom of speech, a lot of the same things that you're hearing today, to tell you the truth. And the way that the police department responded, and due credit to the police department, they didn't deny anything that they were doing. They didn't try and cover it up. They just said that it was within their constitutional abilities as law enforcement to go and do that. Eventually the judge, there was an eventual agreement, the Handshoe agreement, that then said these are not viable things for law enforcement to do that without being warranted, and these are protected civil liberties. So the Handshoe agreement then reduced what Bossy, or what had been renamed at this point, what NYPD intelligence activities could do moving forward into the future, with much greater oversight by the rest of the department, as well as by civilians outside of the department. And that kind of remains the same until after 2001, until after September 11th.
It's interesting you talk about civil liberties, right? Because we're seeing this push right now for free speech in comparison to hate speech. And John and I both argue that hate speech doesn't exist, right? Because we have to have free speech, and we're really getting to this limitations and capabilities of what the First Amendment can do, and we see it as a major problem. Now, what's interesting is you correlate the violence in the 60s and 70s, and we could see the comparisons till now. But with that being said, tools and the way we evolved have changed, and we're in this social media era where people don't, and we talked about this offline before we even started, where people have this less intimate contact. They don't have, this generation in particular, doesn't really have a majority of their time being in face-to-face confrontation or conflict. Things are resolved, and even their life. We talked about dating. They're dating on apps, so there's less interaction. So with that being said, how has social media in this era, how has that had an impact on fueling political violence in comparison to times of the 60s and 70s, where that movement was different, and how messaging and communication was much different?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it for sure. It's like the idea of how social media has changed every aspect of the world. Like, I mean, you can't write a book about that. You have to write a library of books about that. There's no part of the world that hasn't been changed by it, including political activity. First of all, in terms of free speech, right? You put something on Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is, and it's open, that is no longer protected in like like you don't like that is no longer private. You have put that into the world now, you know. So there are a lot of people who like that's impacting their civil liberties. But like, hey, I posted something on Facebook, but it's protected. But like, you know, you're allowed to say it for unless it's inciting violence or something like that. But it's not protected as private speech if you put it in the world, right? Um, that's certainly one aspect of it. There's another aspect of it, I think, where a lot of these social movements um, they increase in popularity because of how many followers the leadership of it has. Charlie Kirk was a tremendously charismatic human being. He had a lot of things to say that a lot of people agreed with, but he also was a tremendously charismatic, engaging human being, and nobody, even his worst detractors, would take that away from him. And that just makes it really, for people like Mr. Kirk, it makes it really easy for them to grow their speech and to grow their audience because of how engaging they are. I think a lot of people said the same thing about Barack Obama, right? Super engaging, super intelligent, super charismatic, and just grew his popularity because of that. That didn't really happen as much in the 60s or 70s. It's like you found your way to a cause because you appreciated the cause. That's not to take away from the leadership of it. There's a reason why they targeted MLK. There's a reason why the Bureau and Chicago police really wanted Fred Hampton from the Chicago Black Panthers off the board. Fred Hampton was a remarkably charismatic person at the age of like 22 when he was killed in a police raid in Chicago, and that police raid barely looks like the mob coming to execute one of their like somebody on the outside, right? There were charismatic people back then, but they had nowhere close to the reach that they have now because of social media. Ideas, good and bad, really kind of they can germinate on social media, and facts can germinate on social media, but falsehoods can also germinate on social media. So, man, it's like how we get out of this, dude. That is, man, if I had the solution to that, I'd be a billionaire or a trillionaire.
So you mentioned how after 9/11, handshoe kind of like that like handcuffing of the police, sort of, or the protection of civil liberties, depending which side of the aisle you stand on, kind of got blurried a little bit. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. There's actually two journalists who were at the AP back then, but then moved over to the New York Times. I mean, they won a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on the unshackling of NYPD after 9/11. So the same federal judge who had administered the Handshoe Agreement to put the limitations on police department intelligence activities actually loosens those restraints in the years after 9/11 to allow for greater activity, and it does unrestrain NYPD a little bit. And now we start getting into a lot of our era. Now we start talking about organizations and individuals who we might actually know on a more personal level. Then, like, modern NYPD Intelligence Division and Counterterrorism Bureau really come into play, and NYPD Intel in the years after 9/11 is, I would say, like, per capita, more capable than CIA. I mean, it's poaching the best and the brightest from CIA, from NSA, from elsewhere in the federal government, and bringing them down to work at NYPD intelligence, their locations where they were working. Really kind of unrestrained, or or less restrained. And unfortunately, NYPD Intel got into some more trouble again once they're unrestrained with, demographics unit and the unwarranted targeting of the Muslim community in New York. Nothing like what Handshoe did, but then it's like, all right, you guys can't have all the toys. You obviously can't play with them well. So got restrained a little bit more. But NYPD Intel now is certainly less restrained than it was during the most restricted years of the Handshoe Agreement, let's say into the 90s. Nobody in the world thinks that an unrestrained NYPD could have prevented 9/11, right? The nexus to New York was not something that even a completely unrestrained NYPD was going to prevent. But that doesn't mean that a lot of the cases that NYPD Intel has been involved in the years since, like the Najibullah Zazi subway attempted bombing and the 10th anniversary, I think, of 9/11, that NYPD was involved in. NYPD Intel does good work. I've, between Rebecca, who's running the shop now, and Mitch Silber, who used to run it before, really smart folks, and they do good work. And there's the other side of it too, where taking officers out of the NYPD infrastructure and putting them into the JTTF has also been a post-Hanshu kind of development, because during the years of Bossie and like the Hoover years, the COINTELPRO years of the Bureau, I mean, the Bureau, no shit, had a liaison an FBI special agent sitting down at Bossie headquarters down near the old headquarters on Center Street, because they were working that closely in probably a way that was not, that wouldn't have stood up to real to real sort of like, inspection in terms of like constitutional violations and whatnot, just because of the sharing of intelligence with criminal courts and warrants and all this stuff that, let's not lawyerize the crap out of that, right? But in the years after Hanshu, you stand up a Joint Terrorism Task Force and you say, these cops, they don't report to NYPD right now. They report to the Bureau, and that kind of takes it out of it, where it's like they're not reporting now for, NYPD criminal case like purposes. Now they're a liaison to the federal government through the Bureau, and that's been a big way to sort of not step around this, to not try and beat the system, but it was a way that I think the Bureau and New York City and NYPD leadership were able to say, there's still a problem here. We still got to investigate terrorism. We recognize civil liberties is something we got to respect, but it doesn't mean we can't not do our job.
So I kind of have a two-part question, because I'm curious, I look at political violence on a global level, and something that we see in countries that it's kind of like part of life, right? And so that being that the U.S. is democracy, do you see the U.S. as less vulnerable than other nations, or is the vulnerability of political violence in different ways? And also, how does the U.S. differ in political violence than what we've seen in other nations?
I don't want to say that we're too unique. There are other places that have suffered some pretty significant political violence and some pretty significant political schisms in their time. And I don't want to lecture you guys or anyone on like all that shit, but I would say that, a lot of countries that have gone through these kind of schisms, it's hard to come out the other end unscathed, is what I would say, But NYPD, you're right. I mean, look, New York City's I don't care if you're left, right, or center, New York City is the capital of the fucking world, and every New Yorker agrees with that, right? I don't care if you're I don't care what kind of political pin you wear on your lapel, like you believe that at the heart, if you're a New Yorker. It is the capital of the world, which means that it is now the stage for the world, which means that everybody is here, which means that if they want to make a point, you want people to listen, you're going to make it here. I mean, a lot of cops here will know the name of Joe Petrosino, who was a lieutenant with the bomb squad investigating anarchism, who died in Sicily 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. Still the last member of NYPD to die in the line of duty overseas. What other department does that? What other department sends detectives and investigators to foreign lands? I know that from public sources and open sources that even NYPD Intel has had detectives sent overseas to places like Israel for not just trainings, but also intelligence sharing, So like NYPD does have that footprint overseas and around the country because we have to, right? I mean, New Yorkers have to be everywhere. We are the target for the world. We're the stage for the entire world, It also means that all the problems of the world manifest here. Like the three of us are sitting here talking on UN General Assembly Week, right? Literally, I could look out my window to the Secretariat building where my partner works, my girlfriend works over there. And like literally the leadership of the entire world is across the East River from me right now. We are the world stage. So which means the world is going to bring its problems here. And I mean, I love that because I don't want New York to be some backwater, but it also means we got to contend with that, which, I talk about it in the book. When Cuban exiles, anti-Castro Cuban exiles were in the U.S., New York is where they centered their campaign, and in Miami, when Croatian nationalist or Puerto Rican nationalist or whoever wants to make a point, they make it here because this is the world stage. When 9/11 decided they wanted to attack, when Al Qaeda decided they wanted to attack on 9/11, it wasn't just attacking the Pentagon and the Capitol. They were going to attack a symbol of America, and that was the World Trade Center. So that's not going away anytime soon. So we are going to have to maintain that vigilance, not just for what's happening domestically, but for what's happening in the entire world.
So just to bring you back, I don't mean to keep bringing you back and forth, but I just got a lot of questions around this because it's just very interesting to me. So in the height of all these bombings, we have all these different radical domestic terror groups running around New York City on the left and the right. And the NYPD is kind of, I don't want to say they're unrestrained, but they just hadn't had that much oversight at that point. They haven't faced these issues before, and they're kind of running around unrestrained with the feds. How effective were they at stopping these terror groups? And how did those terror groups eventually just dissipate to where, I'm in the 90s in a club in New York City and I have no idea that, where I'm at, just right across the street just had a bomb. Had a bomb 20, 30 years, probably, yeah, about 30 years prior. So what was that? Like how effective was the NYPD and the feds at stopping these terror groups?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I'll put it this way: there was a very I won't mention by name, but a very a legendary member of Bossy who went on to leadership in other police departments as well. 50 years ago, this January was the anniversary of the bombing of Francis Tavern down near the World Trade Center. And for some of the listeners who don't remember that, FALN, which is a Puerto Rican nationalist terrorist group, 50 years ago, this past January, bombed Francis Tavern, which is one of the oldest restaurants in the country. George Washington literally celebrated there with his officers at the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. And FALN bombed it 50 years ago in January. I think they killed 6 people and they wounded like 70 or 80. Fragments of dinner plates and knives and forks flying everywhere. It's a pretty gruesome scene. The overhead shot of it is actually on the cover of my book. That is a wild scene. And after the bombing, one of these legendary members of Bossy had said, if we were still able to do our job, these guys never would have gotten going. This wouldn't have happened. And it's hard to prove a negative. It's hard to prove whether or not they actually would have been able to catch those guys. But in the biggest heyday of terrorism, as domestic terrorism is really starting to spike in 69, 70, 70, 71, that's actually the years when Hanshu is coming into effect after that Panther 13 case that we were talking about. So it's hard to say because Bossy was already being, as well as the FBI, they were already starting to be put under really heavy scrutiny by the time domestic terrorism is really taking off. I don't think the two are related. I don't think that, it was the worst time in America in 69, 70, and 71 anyway. It just happened to also be when FBI and NYPD had just gotten the most eyes on them. During the 1960s, when that stuff is really starting to creep up, NYPD did have some successful investigations with the FBI, because they always work joint hand in hand in these kind of investigations. One of them was this plot that I write about was a rookie cop by the name of Ray Wood was sent out by Bossy, a Black American sent out by Bossy to investigate, some radical elements of the civil rights community and adjacent to the civil rights community, like Revolutionary Action Movement, et cetera, et cetera. These real fringe groups that were dedicated to violence, not like the Martin Luther King, nonviolent guys, right? And Ray Wood, in his first couple of months, identifies this plot to blow up the Statue of Liberty, right? It results in no damage being done to the Statue of Liberty, but it results in 3 convictions. And so they were effective. A big complaint at the trial was that it was entrapment, that the detective, or at that point the patrolman, had bought the dynamite, helped to advance the plans. But people called it entrapment. The judge and jury didn't find so. The judge and jury found that this rookie cop had actually helped to break up a plot to bomb the Statue of Liberty. So there are definitely successes. And then in hindsight, there are also probably some violations of civil liberties. But man, that balance of civil liberties and security is something we've been debating for 250 years in this country.
That's interesting. I think that topic, if we go down that rabbit hole about civil liberties, could go on for days. That could be episodes and weeks on its own, because there's so many facets to it. Just when we talk about crime work, doing intrusive police work, we talk about political violence, on what those boundaries are. So now that I'd like to just segue into this, right? Donald Trump has now declared Antifa as a terrorist group. And we have all said it's 5 years a little bit late. Really, it was at the height of 2020. But with that being said, do you see Antifa's actions as political violence? And where do we draw the line between protest, direct action, and terrorism and political violence? What are your thoughts on that?
Man, that is a great question that I've spoken about a lot since the former Attorney General in Trump's first administration started talking about that. And I think that political violence and I think that terrorism is a crime. It doesn't need to be tagged to a particular ideology. I don't give a shit if you. This is me personally speaking. This is David Viola, not like anything else. I don't give a shit if you're driven by the ideals that I embrace and I support the most. If you're embracing crime to support that, you are fucking wrong. And the full weight of law enforcement and the military and the intelligence apparatus is going to come crashing down on you. That being said, I'm very scared, to tell you the truth, about the designation of Antifa, to be perfectly honest, because it's taking an entire political movement and saying that anything associated with it is illegal. And there is no chairman of the board of Antifa in the United States. You need an organization to target an organization. This is what I know from the professional side of my work, I would say. You need an organization to target an organization. If there were the central planning committee of Antifa, violent actions, hell yeah, go target those guys. But Antifa really is just this radical left political ideology, which in the United States is absolutely illegal. It's absolutely authorized. So targeting that and designating that as terrorist ideology is really fucking scary. I mean, we can talk through some similarities. Look, Antifa bombed a bank. Hell yeah, go get them. Or somebody who pledges allegiance to Antifa bombs a bank. Go get them. Throw them in jail. No effing excuses for their violence. But you guys remember Eric Rudolph, right? Eric Rudolph was the guy who bombed the Atlanta Olympics, bombed a bunch of abortion clinics, was responsible for at least a couple of deaths. I mean, if President Clinton, when he was president then, and Janet Reno had said in the wake of Eric Rudolph's attacks, hey, you know what? Anti-abortion now, it's illegal. Because Eric Rudolph was using his anti-abortion ideology to justify his attacks. I think a lot of us would have also been like, F you, Eric Rudolph does not equal, the entire movement. So if you're, the same thing with Timothy McVeigh, Timothy McVeigh had these 2A beliefs, and he had these small government beliefs. Oklahoma City doesn't warrant or justify us saying those are illegal things to believe in. Those are illegal, ideologies. No, Timothy McVeigh was responsible for an act of terrorism, and we killed him. We executed him for it, rightfully so. So the reason I'm concerned about the Antifa thing is it means that if you're conducting violence, which is always illegal, but if you have these beliefs, it now unleashes federal authorities, even if it's not beating you up or arresting you. Maybe now it's hey, you have this Antifa club in your college. Now that gives us warrant to go investigate you, or to tap your lines, or to scrub your data or something like that. And that's what I'm really scared of.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, dude, because, I was very vocal about the vaccine mandate, and a lot of people labeled me as dangerous. Rebecca Weiner, I have big problems with her when it comes to the cracking down on free speech and the labeling of people with certain things, right? Like, and that's what you're saying. And so I totally agree with you that it's like you're not looking at the individual action. You're just labeling somebody and saying, oh, somebody else did this, so your speech is dangerous as a result of this. And there is literally no end to that. And for those of you that haven't, go read the Gulag Archipelago when they started labeling people kulaks. Because you don't think that you could be Antifa, you could be Antifa tomorrow. You know what I mean? And I think that's what you're saying. And if that's what you're saying, I totally agree with you. I think it's wrong. And that's been my biggest issue with all of the political rhetoric and the stuff that's playing out on the streets of New York City today is the language and the political stances are what's demonized. The individuals committing the crime aren't demonized. A lot of this is paid activism, taxpayer-funded paid activism through nonprofits, through elected officials pushing, garnering it. And none of those people are being held accountable, yet the movements themselves are being demonized. The thought. It's almost criminalizing thoughts and speech instead of holding individuals accountable for their actions. And what I see is just a play on both sides, the left and the right, and it's just a constant encroachment of our civil liberties, saying, oh, well, this happened, so you can no longer say this, or that happened, so you're a bad person. And, you know, I watched it happen to myself when all I did was just state a fact, is that what was happening with the mandates violated our civil rights. It violated NYPD policy. It violated equal opportunity policy. And because I did that, I was labeled as somebody that was bringing violence to pharmaceutical companies, right? That CEO got killed. And it wasn't a result of what I was saying. I was just saying, hey, you guys are pushing this mandate down. I wasn't even totally against the vaccine. I was like, all right, take it if you want to take it, you know? And so like that, it scares me, dude. Like the way I'm watching this country move the last 10 years, I'm very afraid. How much do you think speech plays into this? And like, what are your thoughts on, like, we had Pam Bondi recently say that, that there's free speech and then there's hate speech, almost like insinuating that there's a crime of hate speech.
Oh man, like I could not agree with you more. You know, it's like the scary idea of us policing thought is like, I mean, it's Orwellian, right? It's like straight up like 1984. It's fucking scary. And look, I'll be honest with you, and I'll be honest with your listeners. Charlie Kirk said very few things in his really remarkable 32 years of life that I personally agreed with very much. You know, it was absolutely his right to say everything that came out of his mouth. You know, it was his right to have all those beliefs. And the only person who was involved in the crime was the person who went and killed him, and that person will have their day in court. You know, for a lot of people to sort of indict Charlie Kirk for things that he thought or things that he said or things that he advocated for and say that he got what he deserved, that is the absolute antithesis of being an American. You know, the whole reason this country was established was so you can have thoughts that are popular or unpopular and make them popular, which is kind of what Charlie Kirk did in his short but pretty energetic career, right? And I'm scared of the whole hate speech thing too, because Pam Bondi is going to designate certain things are going to be hate speech. It's going to be anything that is critical of the administration that she serves, and it's not going to be anything that's perhaps hateful in support of the things, in support of her career. Who is it? Who is the arbiter of hate speech? You know what I mean? Hate speech becomes politicized. You know, and I am really scared of that. You know.
Guys, so, I just wanna give an update real quick for the audience. There was just a sniper at a Dallas ICE facility. 3 people were wounded. So police were called to the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office just before 7 a.m. local time, 8 a.m. Eastern. Reports of shots fired. Shooter was found dead on the roof of a nearby immigration attorney office. It isn't clear if others were involved in the attack. That just came out, New York Post, by Anthony Blair. So we're seeing more each day. I mean, the political violence is growing. Sorry to cut you off, but
no, please.
Chat.
Thank you for cutting me off. It's like, it just, I think, goes to show what you guys are here talking about is, I mean, it's relevant in real time. You know, we're sitting here talking about political violence in the United States. We mentioned ICE not 30 minutes ago, and here you go. You know, look, I may not be a huge supporter of current ICE practices, but these are guys and gals in uniform who are doing their legal job. You know, for a sniper to be taking aim at them, there is one person in that situation who is wrong, and that is the person who was the sniper. If this all bears out to be the case, you know, that's scary. But you know, where do we go from here, guys? You know,
David, the timing's impeccable, right? You said it. We're talking in real time about a very touchy subject. It's a globalist ideology that affects everyone. And I think that you're absolutely spot on when you said that New York City is the capital of the world, and that's where everyone brings positivity, but they also bring their problems. And it's the center stage for the entire world. And listen to Pam Bondi say that we're going to target you for hate speech. And I said, wow, what does that look like? What are the statute of limitations, and how do you target people? Would that look like prison? Would that be jail time? Would that be cutting off your finances? You know, where do we go? So basically what I want to say is, in your research and your life experience at this point, how do we define when it comes to speech online, or whether it's in person, if it's a protest, how do we define that? When does it cross into incitement of political violence? And so we don't cut off civil liberties. And how should the police respond? How should law enforcement respond? Like, how do we get to that point? Because it seems like it's a fine line between extremist speech and political violence. So how do we identify that, where we don't cut off civil liberties, as what we're speaking about right now when it comes to hate speech and freedom of speech, and how does law enforcement respond?
I think that you mentioned the critical, and I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to pretend to be a lawyer. I took a constitutional law class with Jack Goldsmith from Bush II's administration, which was one of the best classes I ever took. Don't make me a lawyer. I think that the critical line that you're talking about is the critical line that we need to. It's not like a gray area. It's a black and white line, and that's incitement. You know. If you, through your speech, are inciting others to violence, that is a crime by U.S. code. You know, having unpopular beliefs and incitement, then that opens you up now to law enforcement and other kinds of activities. Having unpopular beliefs, whether or not that means you were a member of the American Communist Party in the 1950s, not illegal, but still opened up a lot of people to intelligence activities and other kinds of activities, the worst parts of McCarthyism, right? Or now, under the current administration, under Pam Bondi as AG, having leftist thoughts are going to be designated as hate speech. But if there's no incitement, it's not a crime. You know, if there's no incitement, it's just things that you don't agree with, and you can't investigate somebody. You can't hold them up to the chilling effects of a federal investigation just because you don't like their thoughts. You know, I think that rightfully so. A lot of people on the American right in previous administrations, you know, they thought that they were being held up to investigation just for having unpopular beliefs. And I think that what Pam Bondi is doing is saying we're absolutely going to do that. You know, it's not just you guys and, you know, it's this shooter, whoever it's going to be in Utah, you know, taking their belief and saying your entire belief is hateful because it inspired this one person to act. So now your entire belief set is open to criminal investigation and terrorist code, you know, which is really, really scary. I shouldn't have to lecture the Attorney General on legality, right? But like, if there's no incitement, there's no crime, you know, and investigating a non-crime is exactly how you define a police state. And that is not where we want to go.
Yeah, no, I know. And a lot of people aren't understanding the point with Antifa. So David's not saying anyone that's involved in that has committed a crime or is involved in plotting a crime. He's saying you could easily, that you in this chat currently who are saying, yes, let's criminalize Antifa, you could be labeled Antifa tomorrow. How? I could just label you as you're a member of Antifa. And now the government's investigating you and you're a member of Antifa because maybe they have one radical thought. But, well, I don't even want to say radical thought. Maybe they have a thought that you agree with. Maybe you agree with your anti-abortion, let's say, like, or you're pro-abortion, excuse me, you're pro-abortion. Maybe you agree with that thought. Well, that's one of the thoughts of Antifa. So you're an Antifa member, and now we could investigate you. Did you advocate for violence? Did you commit a crime? No. Maybe you advocated to a politician your belief. Maybe you held, you advocated on social media to a politically appointee of a police department or of an organization because you weren't happy with something. You could easily be labeled, and that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about criminalizing thought, and what's happening in this country. If you aren't paying attention, and listen, I voted for Donald Trump 3 times, but I'm going to tell you right now, his administration in a lot of ways mirrors the Joe Biden administration. I don't see many differences, and it could easily flip on its head. It could be Antifa tomorrow, and you could be a white supremacist on the next 4 years when we get AOC. Now you're a white supremacist. Why are you a white supremacist? Oh, you were against the COVID-19 vaccine. You don't believe in a DEI. You don't believe in this. Now you're a terrorist. What'd you do other than give your opinion? Nothing. Right? But now if you're anti-DEI and you're anti-vax and you're working with a criminal organization, you're committing crimes, you're plotting acts of terror, absolutely you should be held accountable. But till today, 12 years we've been going on, nobody's being held accountable. Hold the individuals that are plotting, planning, funding, and doing it accountable. Let's not criminalize thought. And so anyone that's not getting that, you're down a real slippery slope here. Sorry for my rant.
No, thank you for that rant, and thank you for saying what I didn't say clear enough. Apparently, and I apologize to anyone who gets offended, but I kind of apologize. But the reality is that I completely agree with you. It's like anyone who has said I'm a member of Antifa and they go and blow up throw a pipe bomb in a bank, arrest that son of a bitch and throw the book at them. 100%. Someone who says, first of all, there's no organization. You need to designate an organization as a terrorist group. You can't designate a thought or a belief as I have never met the president of Antifa USA, and I've never seen an Antifa membership card. Not that Al Qaeda had that, but they kind of had a leadership. If you swore allegiance to Al Qaeda was and is a designated foreign terrorist organization. And they actually had an organization that you could target. Antifa doesn't really have that. It just has like a set of beliefs. And the white supremacy thing that you talk about is exactly on point, man. It's like someone should be able to say, not that I would say this, someone should be able to say, I think the white race is best, and I believe in the white race running the country. For as repugnant as I might find that thought and that belief, totally fucking legal, Totally something that you should be able to say without the federal government, be it President Trump or President Biden or President AOC, investigating you for saying that. Same thing with Antifa. You should be able to say, I don't like fascist, which, by the way, is not like a really fucking like weird thing to say. I don't like fascist is not something that we said that for 100 years without it being, very, very polarizing, But if some like college kid like says I don't like fascist on their Instagram account, and now the federal government says that person is admitted they're a member of Antifa, and now we can investigate them, that is a scary fucking place. And I'm sorry, I don't think we want to go that route, because that shit will get turned around. To your point, John, that should get turned around real quick and say, you said you don't believe in equal opportunity. So that means you're a white supremacist, and we have designated white supremacy as a terrorist organization, which is fucking bonkers, But nobody wants that, and
and now we're gonna freeze your bank account,
and now we're gonna freeze your bank account, and now we're gonna take away your wife's green card or whatever it is. We don't want to go there. When all these kind of laws and all these kind of restrictions, the way that I like to think about it is just imagine it being turned around on you, because American history, to your point, Eric, American history shows that at some point it probably will be.
Well, that's my point to this, right? Hearing Pam Bondi say it, on the surface level, there's some people that are very emotionally invested right now, and they're not thinking straight. And they're thinking, wow, that's right, let's get those people with hate speech. But if we sit back and we start to peel back the layers, we have to say to ourselves, well, what does that look like? That's what I've been saying. Is that the police showing up at your house having a conversation like we see in England? Or are they going to lock you up, put you in jail, or even worse? They're going to seep into your bank account and cut off your finances. What does that look like? Now, she said we'll target you, but she didn't say how. And that's why I think it's so important. We always have to put our finger and discuss the U.S. Constitution, because our civil liberties, and some people say they're God-given rights, but they're God-given rights that have to be fought for, not necessarily physically at war, but by having communication and conversation. And that's why I think this is scary, because if we actually restrict what we consider hate speech, to me, what we do is we restrict communication. And that's what I think is so powerful. What's made this world more powerful now than ever is communication. We could communicate with some kid in Africa right now, maybe in a poor village, who has access to a phone, which makes this world smaller. We more have that kind of intimate relationship where now we can communicate with people throughout the entire world. So things move faster. So to me, I think that it's even more scary now with social media. Messaging communication moves much faster than it did before when we talk about terrorism and political violence. So I guess it's a simple question. And I think we know the answer, but I would love to hear from your professional standpoint and from you just as a person, because you're so passionate about it. I love it. I think this is an amazing conversation. People have to have this conversation constantly over and over to remind themselves. But does cutting off civil liberties, and does that actually cut off potential extremists, or does that actually radicalize people even more?
Whew. I mean, that's a scary question. So I think that history shows in a couple of different ways that, so for instance, you look at international places, right? You look at Iran before like 1979 and before the revolution that ousted the Shah, right? A lot of people said, hey, the Shah, used to crack down on everybody and there was no dissent because he literally threw them all in prison. And it wasn't until he opened the door a tiny bit that he allows Khomeini and some other radicals to actually start having a voice, and that festered into the revolution. That's not the example we want to use. We don't want to say, yes, you must crack down on all dissent to keep the state in order. We don't want to become the fucking Shah of Iran in 1976. That's not what we're trying to do. I think that when you look at when you look at our own history and you look at our Constitution, like you're talking about, I mean, we have to live with the best and the worst aspects of our Constitution. We have to live with people we don't agree with, because that's exactly why we're all Americans. We can't just bludgeon all their opinions and hope that they don't radicalize. There was in 1963, and I call this out in my book. There was an activist at CORE, at the Congress of Racial Equality, like super Martin Luther King nonviolent organization. And in 1963, after everything that was happening in Birmingham at that point, and this is like almost a direct quote, he said, "It's really hard to tell a man who is being beaten and killed not to reach for his gun or his knife." So I think that when you take away peaceful activism and fucking crazy cat and peaceful dissent, you're forcing people to become extreme. You're forcing them to have no other opportunity other than to advocate for what they want than extremism. You have to give them the ballot box. You have to give them the ballot box. You have to give them access to the ballot box, and you have to give them access to peaceful activism. People ain't gonna stop believing that they want to do what they want to get. They're gonna be like, all right, well, now we're gonna go to. We literally saw this, right? By any means necessary, right? You take away the peaceful means, and then you start getting people saying by any means necessary, and we don't want to get there, because then that's when we stop talking to each other and we start shooting at each other.
No, yeah, I think, I think we've been watching that since October 7th. A lot of that, I think, we've been getting a lot more radical, a lot more violent. The protests are escalating every day, and the rhetoric's escalating because, again, people are expressing idea. Some people are breaking the law. Some people aren't. Some people are just expressing their ideas, and then they're being labeled as terrorists. They're being labeled as this. And then as that's happening, people are becoming more radicalized, in my opinion, as a result of that. When it goes to the pro-Palestinian movement, I've seen people turn. And I think that's because of the way we've been labeling people. And, if you're committing a crime, I don't feel bad for you. You know what I mean? Like, you should be arrested. If you're just expressing your beliefs, then you shouldn't be labeled a terrorist and treated as if you are one. And I think that's the slippery slope in America, and it's always been, is that, like, we have to have the ability to disagree with each other. We have to have these opposing ideas. We have to respect these opposing ideas and give people a platform to be able to vent, instead of looking to take them away and label people as terrorists because you don't agree with them. Like I said, you labeled a terrorist on the Republican governor. If you're on the left, you're labeled under a Democratic governor. You're labeled a terrorist when you're on the left. So it's like it's a very slippery slope. And the end of the day is all we're doing is cheering on, giving away our freedom for the guise of safety. Again, Dave, like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you said it kind of, that, like, it's really up for speculation with all of the actions that the government was doing prior to Hanshu. That, yeah, they did a good job, but they didn't necessarily keep New Yorkers safe. They didn't necessarily stop terrorism as a result of taking away civil liberties. And, just think if we lived in a total totalitarian government. You can't say anything. You can't think everything. Only the approved narrative is you're allowed to speak. Could we have prevented 9/11?
So 9/11 is a really interesting example, right? Because you look at the 9/11 Commission report, and it points out, Al-Hamzi, and there was one other person, I forget his name, who were in the United States, who had been identified by CIA and NSA as being members of Al Qaeda after a meeting in Kuala Lumpur, I believe, a year or two before. But because of the compartmentalization of the intelligence community, after COINTELPRO and after all the things I talk about in my book, and the Church Committee and the Senate that had really put restrictions on the intelligence community because of some really effed up shit we were doing. My community, I'm an intel officer, right? They were saying that in the 9/11 Commission that CIA and NSA had identified these two individuals, and they knew that they had visas to enter the United States legally. That was not shared with FBI until weeks before 9/11. And FBI at that point had open investigations into these guys, but had not tracked them down. So it's impossible to prove a negative, right? But if FBI had no restrictions on it, and the intel community had no restrictions on it, and CIA can tell NYPD and FBI everything they want to say, warrants be damned, could 9/11 have been averted because maybe FBI catches these two guys and they pull the thread? I don't know. Maybe not. But, like, to your point, do you want to live in that police state? Like you brought up like Israel and Palestine. I lived in Syria for a short while prior to the war. During the Bashar Assad times, like in the best times of Bashar Assad, the best times of Bashar Assad. But when he was trying most to, like, come out into the West. I mean, I lived there when Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie visited him, and he was like driving them around Damascus, right? The truth is that Syria was a really safe place if you did exactly what the government wanted. You can go running in the worst neighborhoods in Syria and nothing's going to happen to you. No one's going to say a word to you or rob you because they'll get their hands or head chopped off. I don't think that I think that we want to, Charlie Kirk even said it about the Second Amendment. I would say it about civil liberties in general. We're willing to accept a place that is a little bit less kind to our beliefs, to grant other people beliefs so we can have ours, And I don't want to live in Bashar Assad's Syria, no matter how safe it is, right? And I mean, that is a slippery slope that we're getting to, because then if that is where we want to go to, a place that we only care about security, then whose version of security were you looking for? Again, Donald Trump and Joe Biden probably have very different, or Rashida Tlaib, or whoever you want to pick on the radical left side. They've got very different visions of what pure security look like, and I don't want to live in either one of those places, to be honest. Like, you brought up Israel, right? I lived in Israel for a short while, between Israel and the West Bank, and West Jerusalem and Ramallah for a while as well, on a State Department contract. And hey, man, like, I believe that people out there protesting at universities, protesting Israel, that is their constitutionally granted right to go do so. When you start assassinating young people who work for the Israeli embassy just because they're Jewish, or because that is a god awful crime, and the book should be thrown at you. There is a distinction between protesting and shooting somebody.
That's a great point. Talk about protesting and the distinction between actual violence, right? And I agree. We always have this discussion, right? We're tipping the scales between civil liberties, freedoms. It's not a perfect society. I think that's what you identified, and I would rather put an emphasis on our civil liberties. And yes, are there things about these type of societies that have control that make life safer? Yes, in many ways, of course, and the intentions may be good, but then that puts a factor on your civil liberties, and you don't have that freedom. And I think people feel like sometimes they're in a cage. I think our civil liberties are far more important, and it's upon ourselves to have culture and community, also to be a part of our safety. And I think that's what's important, and it's paramount. So with that being said, listen, I was a special operations lieutenant with the NYPD, and predominantly my entire career was doing intrusive police work, right? And the ideology of doing intrusive police work is to stop a crime and prevent it before it happens, right? We get information that someone may commit a shooting, and we get that guy with a firearm and stop him before he commits it. So why I make that point is to make the correlation. If you could tell me, what do you think are the warning signs that someone is crossing from anger, or maybe not just someone, a group is crossing from anger and expression to extremism, right? Because we talk about tipping the scales between civil liberties and safety measures. But so where is that fine line? What are the warning signs that someone has crossed from freedom of speech, anger, expression, to get to extremism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a cool question, and I think it's the hardest one to answer, right? And again, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to pretend to be a lawyer. I'm a historian and an intelligence officer, which means I'm about as far from being a lawyer as you can get, right? So from my perspective, like, even in your job, right, Eric, it's like you take somebody who says, "I hate Jews," for as repugnant as I find that. You know what? That is a legal, if not disgusting, thing to say, right? You say, "I hate Jews and I just bought a gun." All right, now you're starting to maybe monitor this person without being invasive. Somebody says now, "I hate Jews, I bought a gun, I'm going to use it on Jews." Now you've crossed the line into a legal activity right there. And I think that's what we need to do. It's like saying, like, that first thing, "I hate Jews." If Pam Bondi is calling the shots, somebody says, "I hate Donald Trump." That is a very legal thing to say. Some people might find it really repugnant and really offensive, right? You can't investigate somebody just for saying that. "I hate Donald Trump and I got a gun." All right, Secret Service is going to start paying attention to your social media accounts. "I hate Donald Trump, I got a gun, I'm going to use it." That's illegal. Now you're going to get arrested. And I think that we need to be careful to not investigate or arrest people just for saying the one thing: "I hate Donald Trump, I hate Jews, I hate blondes, I hate short guys." None of those things are illegal, no matter how offensive they might be to somebody. "I hate short people and I'm going to kill them all with the gun I just bought. I'm short," like, I hope that somebody's investigating them for saying that.
Mikey G says, what you're basically saying is there's steps and phrases in hate speech that constitute a crime. I don't think that David's saying that at all. I think that he's saying there's steps between speech
And incitement.
and a crime. There's steps between speech and a crime, right? Like, if I verbally threaten you, that's a threat. That's a crime. That's not constitutionally protected speech. I like, again, I'm willing to debate anyone, including the president or Pam Bondi, on what hate speech is and when we define it. If they want to come up with those definitions, I don't think anyone's going to be willing to take that debate, because there is, words are words. Words.
Totally.
Word.
I hate XYZ.
Yeah.
Hate XYZ is and never should be illegal. Say it.
Yeah, totally. What was my question? Oh man, I lost it because I was responding to Mikey J.
No, and by the way, I just wanted to say, like, I'm seeing a lot of like really interesting comments pop up on the viewers, and I really appreciate it. Like, we haven't been able to respond to all of them, man, but I love this space because of how engaged everyone is. So, you can find my emails online if everyone wants. It's like you can get in touch if there's any questions I'm not answering. I'm happy to keep talking about this stuff.
Yeah. For those of you watching on, everybody except for you on X, I put all David's links in the bio of this thing. So to purchase his book, to contact him, his LinkedIn. So if you guys want to reach out to him, definitely do so. The book was good. Honestly, it was a real history lesson for me, because I just never realized how much stuff, even the Foley square bombing, I didn't really know about that at all.
There's a lot. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole lot, and I don't want to dive too much into history, but like, history is everywhere. I remember there was this cafe that closed during COVID on West Broadway that I used to go to all the time, right? And I I actually worked there when I was in high school, and I knew the baristas and I knew everybody for decades, right? And in 2020, right before COVID, I was still researching the book, and I was probably still finishing my PhD dissertation. And I'm sitting down at the coffee bar for like 2 hours with this sweet 5'0" like Jewish grandmother, right? And we're just sitting there chatting. And she's so pleasant. And she walks out, and the barista who I'd known for, at this point, since I was a teenager, he's like, "Oh, she was so sweet. Is that your grandmother or something?" I'm like, "No, she's a former Weather Underground bomber who was a federal fugitive and was on the run for 2 years." And his mind was blown. It's like, literally at 20 years old, she bombed Foley Square. And ended up going on the run with the Weather Underground, going underground, coming out, going to jail for 2 or 3 years, then coming out of jail and living her life. History is everywhere in New York, man. And I appreciate that you found some stuff that even someone like you, with all this experience, and all this time in New York, you were able to find some new things about the city. Like, I can't walk through the city now without being like, "Oh yeah, someone so-and-so bombed that, so-and-so bombed that," which is like a bugged out way to walk around New York, but that's kind of the way I walk around it now.
It's interesting, because that, to me, it's like the red car theory, right? Where you want to think about these things, but if you're looking for a red car, all of a sudden you'll see every red car. But that's pretty much what it is, right? That's your world. So you're like, "Oh, this building, that building." There's a great comment here, and I think this is true. And it's a simple comment, but it's pretty accurate. Craig CB says hate speech is just a made up word as assault rifle. And I agree, because what I see from the left is they categorize everything as an assault rifle to kind of demonize weapons, right? And make you believe that it's this weapon that's just a weapon of death. And that's not the reality, right? And they miscategorize and misrepresent every firearm as these assault rifles with lack of knowledge. And I say they suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect. So to me, hate speech is the same thing. Like, what is hate speech? We've been talking about this quite often. Pam Bondi said it. Even in the NYPD, they have what's called the disciplinary matrix. So what administrative infractions police officers can be held to. And one of them, which John and I spoke about 3 years ago at the infancy of this podcast, is hate speech. Like, what? And it's actually subject to termination. Like, what is that? So in your opinion, your experience, and all the stuff we're talking about, what exactly is hate speech? What do you think they mean when they say hate speech? Or do you think they're ambiguous on purpose to get to a point that it can be utilized and weaponized for whatever reasons that the political government sees purpose or significance in it?
Yeah, and again, like, I don't want to pretend to be a lawyer, but like, the way I look at what people talk about in hate speech is, like, literally it's 2 words: it's hateful and it's speech, and that, I think, is protected by the Constitution. I think that when we start talking about legislation against hate speech. It is hateful speech that is incitement to violence against that category. Um, Hating something where there's no nexus to a crime being committed is just language that offends somebody else. And if you are using hateful speech to incite or to justify your own violence or to incite others to violence, then that's a crime. And I don't know at the federal or local level in terms of if that's used as amplifying, like a crime. Like there's violence, but it was hateful. If that, if that amplifies a crime, kind of like you know, like civil rights violations and a murder, like what happened in like the Mississippi burning case. Does that amplify a federal crime, and is that justified? I don't know, maybe. But if it's just hateful speech, I think that all three of us, and we might disagree on a lot of things politically, but I think the three of us would agree emphatically that you should be allowed to hate things or people or ideas and say so, as long as there is no incitement to violence or violence connected to that. And that's all I would say on it. And I think that we have a great tradition of disagreeing in this country. Um, at the end of the day, we have usually come together after disagreements and gotten together. I mean, one of my I kind of can't even think about it without getting goosebumps still these days. Like I was actually living in Syria um, when Obama was elected the first time. I was pleased that he was elected. Navy guy I am. Like I was also a big supporter of John McCain. John McCain's concession speech that night was one of the most wonderful political speeches I've ever seen in my entire life. Senator McCain at the time went up and literally said, just called President-elect Obama to congratulate him, and somebody like was booing in the audience. And Senator McCain stopped him. He's like, no, we should all as Americans be proud of this moment the things we did. And McCain even said, he's like, there are a lot of things that I disagree with President-elect Obama very much, and I will fight him from the Senate on those things. But we will also find ways to work together. And man, did we just stray really far from that moment, that remarkable moment when like who was the scion of the conservative movement in America at the time, was saying that he's going to try and work with the first elected Black president, in the United States. Man, we have just strayed really far from that time, right? But that speech of his, right? No, he was like, no, we can disagree. I disagree with this guy on fucking nothing, but I'm going to find a way to work together with him. Man, if we just gone far from that. I don't even know how I got on this tangent, but like you should be allowed to disagree with people without it being illegal, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just because a lot of the violence is stemming from rhetoric, right? And I think it's totally relevant. It's relevant to talk about the play on words and the labeling of people. Even the word racist, like I hate it. I've been called. I think I get called it like 50 times a day. I've called people it, and it's stupid, honestly, because at the end of the day, just because you said something doesn't make you a devout racist. You might have said something that's discriminatory. You might have used a racial slur. It doesn't mean that you're a racist. And that, and that's how things devolve, is because we're just throwing people in boxes, and really tribalism's forming. So I think that's kind of what we're talking about, is like we're devolving into a tribalistic society instead of a country of ideas. And with one shared goal of having a better, safer, more prosperous America. And so like that, I think that's where we're going. How much, like, throughout history, though, when you look at the 60s, the 70s, how involved do you think that politicians played a role in the escalation of political violence, and then bringing it on to today? Like, how have they played a role? And if so, like, what role do you believe?
Yeah, man, that is a scary part, I would say, to be honest, and this is where we all might disagree. You look at the 60s and 70s and the political leadership we had at the time, be it, be it LBJ, or be it Richard Nixon or Carter or Ford, whoever it is. For the most part, they really tried to dial it back. I think that like something I may have mentioned to you guys earlier, when during what we call like the hard hat riots, right? I think it was in 71. A bunch of anti-war protesters right down near the Trade Center, or what was then the construction site of the World Trade Center, were just marching and protesting, and a bunch of hard hats, a bunch of construction workers, pretty violently assaulted them, like, broken teeth, concussions, a bunch of people in the hospital. They call it the hard hat riots, including a bunch of construction workers from the World Trade Center, which has its own kind of irony, right? And Nixon publicly said, like, thank God for the hard hats, right? And for as much as like that may have been like, condoning violence, Nixon never said anything more insightful than that, and that's probably the worst example I could think of, at least domestically. I fear right now that President Trump, his rhetoric is a complete opposite. I fear that President Trump's rhetoric is very othering, like we're talking about. There's us and we are right. If you agree with me, we are correct, and everyone else is a radical, is this or that. And I fear that the president's and his administration's rhetoric is greatly enhancing this schism between Americans, not working towards like a common America, but there's our vision of America, and everyone else is a radical who's trying to defeat that. And even his statements at Charlie Kirk's funeral, unfortunately, I think like amplified that. Charlie Kirk's widow was saying things like, let's try and get together. And President Trump, and I'm just paraphrasing now, is like, no, I don't have to love our enemy. I want to defeat them. It's like, no, man, like we're not enemies. We're fucking Americans, So I feel like the political leadership now, specifically speaking, President Trump, the rhetoric from the administration is much more caustic, is much more insightful, not from a legal standpoint, but was much more like, amplifying than it was in the 60s. Like, you don't have to like LBJ, you don't have to like Richard Nixon, but they never said things like the current administration is saying, is what I would argue.
I think you're spot on. And what's interesting, I think that you look at we talk about protests and riots throughout our history, and most of them, I think, were really based on racism, which is something I think is far different than today. Like the Zoot Suit riots, right? It's really just based on pure racism. But in comparison today, where I think a lot of the protests and riots are about identities, right? Do you identify with Palestine? Do you identify with Israel? Do you identify with Jews? Do you identify with LGBTQ? So much, as we talk about tribalism, and these groups get split off, and not just about hating yourself, but how do you identify hating that other group? So in your role, your professional role, how do you educate? How do you educate, and what type of messaging can we use on social media that prevents political violence? What type of messaging and education can we provide that really prevents it? Because we talked about all these subjects today, right? We don't want to remove civil liabilities. We don't want to take that away. We want to ensure freedom of speech. We want to understand that hate speech doesn't exist, while at the same time we have to educate people of what political violence is and how do we prevent it, right? Because I think solutions and prevention is the ultimate choice and decision to stop it without cutting off civil liberties. So how do we educate them? What is the messaging?
Oh man, it's funny. It's like I had a friend who got offered a job in the first Obama administration to go be like the social media person, like during like the transition. And I remember thinking back then, I was like, oh, what is this social media bullshit? What an unimportant job. And now it's like maybe the most important job in the executive fucking office, right? Is that person, and that's how you communicate to Americans or to the world now, is through social media, right? In my personal opinion, informed by my profession, I think, and like through study of history, would be that the messaging that we, in a perfect world, that we would find would be that common ground as Americans, not like I'm going to define the ground and everyone's got to come there to be correct. I mean, we have never been more unified as a nation in my memory, in my lifetime, than the day that President Bush stood atop the pile at ground zero, right? I didn't vote for President Bush then, but goddamn, was I a proud American the day that he stood on top of that, and we found common ground. Study of history, and especially being a Navy man, we were very much at each other's throats prior to Pearl Harbor about whether or not we should enter the war. You know, Pearl Harbor came and all of those differences faded away. We were entirely united for a common cause to defend our nation. You know, we might have disagreed about what that nation meant. You know, Jim Crow is still a thing. It was not a perfect nation. It certainly is not a perfect nation now. But we identified, you know, we found that common ground and said, this is the common ground that we are going to defend and work to make better, you know, and we're not there now, you know, and I think that either the administration or somebody outside of it probably, or somebody who hasn't been identified yet, has got to be the person to find that common ground to say, this is what all of us are. This is a common set of ideals that I don't care if you're, you know, extreme leftist or extreme rightist. You know, I don't care if you live in the Bronx and you voted for Jamal Bowman, or if you live in Idaho and you vote for whoever. You know, like, there is this common thing that unites us, and this is what we're going to build off of. I don't think that there's a voice in America right now who's actually articulating that. There's just voices who are saying, F those guys and girls and what they believe in. What I believe in is the only version of America that has value, and screw all the other versions. And that's a dangerous place to go, because all it does is put us into warring camps, you know?
No, yeah, man. I you know, like a couple of, like, I usually don't really re-listen to things that I don't like. But I've been re-listening to this speech over and over and over again, because it really, like, I find some things, just like I had supervisors in the NYPD that I saw them do things and I was like, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to do that when I become a supervisor. I'm never going to say what that guy said. I'm never going to treat the people under me like that. I'm not going to act like how they act. And then I found people that I liked and I was like, yeah, I'm going to do stuff like that. You know, and I emulated them. And you know, one of the things, like, with this platform is that, like, I had watched an interview that Hannity conducted with de Blasio, and it was horrible. And I kept watching it because I'm like, I just let the guy talk. And I couldn't stand Bill de Blasio, but I'm like, just let him talk. So I always said, I was like, if I ever interview someone, I don't care if I don't agree with them. I'm going to let them talk. You know what I mean? Like that, I was like, the worst thing I ever watched. But going back on the Kirk service now, we had played this video already, and I support Stephen Miller's right to free speech. You could say whatever you want. You could be as weird as you want. You could have your little hands and say whatever the hell you want to say, right? Like, you could do whatever you want to do. But I think as leaders in this country, we have a responsibility. They, particularly as heads of the state, you know, deputy chief of staff for policy, you know, he's one of the most powerful men in America. And I think what he says here is so divisive. And I think it really, it doesn't only fail the people who he's labeling as his enemies. It has no business at a memorial service. That's one. I'll say that. That hands down was, I think, totally disrespectful to Kirk's memory, to his wife, to the family, to his supporters. Sounded more like a rhetoric campaign speech than anything else I've heard. But I think even just me listening to it as somebody who is a Republican, as somebody who voted for this administration, all I'm hearing is, well, if you don't go along with us, you're going to do everything we say. And if you don't, you're my enemy. Listen to this real quick. I just want to get your thoughts on this.
The light will defeat the dark. We will prevail over the forces of wickedness and evil. They cannot imagine what they have awakened. They cannot conceive of the army that they have arisen in all of us. Because we stand for what is good, what is virtuous, what is noble. And to those trying to incite violence against us, those trying to foment hatred against us, what do you have? You have nothing. You are nothing. You are wickedness, you are jealousy, you are envy, you are hatred. You are nothing. You can build nothing. You can produce nothing. You can create nothing. We are the ones who build. We are the ones who create. We are the ones who lift up humanity. The light will defeat the dark.
I mean, it just bothered me because I'm like sitting there and I'm saying, who's we? You know, and I thought it was very divisive, and I thought something like that is not something that a leader should say. I don't mean to pick on Stephen Miller, but like I can't stop watching it. It annoyed me.
The divisive is the exact word that I think I've been struggling to find, you know, and look, you're allowed to be divisive, you know, but I think that, you know, because if you want to be divisive, one, it's his, like you said, that is his constitutionally granted right to get up there on stage and say all the things he said, no matter how kind of disgusting I find them personally, you know, or how unhelpful I think they are from the public policy standpoint, which is way more important than my fucking personal opinions on it. But as leaders, you're a Marine, Eric, you know, it's like the way that I think about leadership is always summed up by the very simple phrase that we learn as military leaders, and that is officers eat last, you know, like, I don't care where you are a leader. I don't care if it's in the military. I don't care if it's in the PD. I don't care if it's in the White House. You eat last because everyone in front of you is more important than you. Everyone who put you in that position, you know, who you ostensibly lead is more important. And I think what Stephen Miller is doing in that speech and what a lot of the rhetoric of this administration is saying is that I will eat first, and then the people who believe in me will eat. And then the others that Stephen Miller is talking about, we will eat them, is what he's saying. And I mean, look, there have been too many comparisons drawn, and I think that historically they're a lot excessive. But my most recent posting was in Germany with Special Operations Europe with Sakior, and I, you know, took a side trip to Munich, you know, because Munich is a fucking wonderful city, and it's also the birthplace of the Third Reich, you know. And you go to the museum there of the Third Reich, and there's a lot of speeches that they have up in the walls that sound a lot like that shit that Stephen Miller just said, you know, intentionally divisive. You know, there is us and we are right, and history is on our side, and God is on our side. Everyone else, we will crush them. You know, it is really scary to hear. I mean, Stephen Miller is one of the most important, one of the most powerful men in the United States. He's also never been elected, you know, and that is even more scary, you know, that we're putting people like Stephen Miller or like Elon Musk, when he was part of the administration, these enormous amounts of power in the hands of people who have never been elected. You know, it's one thing. Americans have the right to elect all types of idiots, you know, regardless of how you define idiot, you know, be it the Joe Biden version of idiot, the Donald Trump version of idiot, whoever you think is an idiot, right? But that's one thing to say, hey, that's on us. We elected this person. Joe Biden was rightfully elected. Donald Trump was rightfully elected. Stephen Miller has never been rightfully elected to anything, to fucking class president, maybe. You know, so that kind of power and that kind of rhetoric coming from somebody to saying that kind of stuff, it's just, that is not the solution to the problem, is the only thing I would say. You know, is that we have a problem. And I was talking with like some folks at NBC last week about this, is that the reality is we have a crisis of political violence, you know, not a crisis of like left-wing political violence and not a crisis of right-wing political violence. We have a crisis of political violence, and everybody shares some of the blame in it. And the way out of that is decidedly, categorically not the kind of stuff that Stephen Miller was saying just there.
You know, brother, you're spot on, because I say that all the time, and I've actually said it numerous times on this podcast, that when you're in a leadership position, it's something I learned in the Marine Corps, but something that should transpose and should be in all agencies, or just a part of life, even in a family, right? If you're a father, you eat last. You make sure your wife and kids eat first, always in that leadership role. And it's not just about food. It paints a bigger picture, right? It shows the importance that, hey, you take care of your people. And you're right. And that's what we see in this country, is that this country is now eating itself. And you're right. And where the politicians believe that they don't serve the public and they want the public to serve them. I see that as extremely problematic. So typically when we do interviews, we read out some comments. There's just so many flying in. But I think this is a great question. Joel Ramirez, buddy of mine, I know him. I think he meant John and Eric. It looks like it's a typo. He said John and Erica. Kind of funny. But he says, give it.
I think he did it on purpose.
Thanks, Joel, by the way. Maybe you could have put Eric. He says, given Dr. Viola's role as a professor, this is actually a good question, because a lot of people question universities these days. Can we ask if he believes colleges are fostering radicalization among students? What do you think?
I don't believe that that's the case. Certainly not John Jay. You know, John Jay is not exactly known as being the most lefty liberal university in the place. It's in the country, certainly not in the state even, or in the city even. I don't think that that's the case. I think that what universities tend to do is they tend to have people who, through the course of getting to their positions, they learn critical thinking and they learn facts. And I think that a lot of radicalization is devoid of those things. Like, we are going to become bifurcated. We're going to ignore the facts. We're going to ignore critical thinking. We're going to focus on our funnel and what we believe. Does that mean that there's people like, I don't want to mention them by name, but people who are at Columbia or elsewhere who are dogmatic about what they believe? Yeah, 100%. You say the same thing in business school. It's like you don't find a lot of social equity people in business school because they believe in capitalism. The reality is that I think you go to some of these institutions, you find a lot of people who believe in critical thinking, who believe in fact-based argumentation, and it kind of obviates a lot of people who are actually on the extremes. That you have universities that have been the hotbed of, in the time period that I focused on in my studies, right, the 1960s and 1970s, universities were the hotbed of social activism when it came to anti-war movement. The reality is that the Vietnam War has not played out historically to be something that a whole lot of us are in favor of. That the universities were at the forefront of that. One, it means that they were thinking about it more in historical terms and not just the rhetoric that Democratic and Republican administrations were putting out there. You got to fight the war because you got to fight communism. They were thinking about it more critically and more history-based and more fact-based, and very few of us say that we should have stayed in Vietnam and just kept on fighting it past 75 at this point. So I think that there's that. Do I think that there tends to be a leftist bent in universities? Absolutely. I think that to say anything other than that is untrue. But that's like saying that there's a conservative bent on Wall Street. That's kind of part and parcel with the industry that it is, and education is an industry. I don't think that it produces radicals. I think that it produces critical thinking, which often leads people away from dogmatic beliefs, which is kind of where we are right now on both sides.
Yeah, I think you're getting beat up here in the chat, Dave. I'm not going to lie to you. Because I think, especially, and I've seen some of the coursework around the social justice aspect, and a lot of I don't even want to categorize them in a political class, but a lot of cops have an issue with it, and they say there's a real leftist bent on the social justice classes in particular. They're really geared to, this is what it is, and here are the 4 questions, and it's in this box, and it doesn't. You're not allowed out of here. So I'm not gonna lie, you're getting crushed right now.
What's interesting is that
it's all good fun.
Teaching desegregation 50, 60 years ago was pretty radical, So I think that universities try to not be backward looking. They try to understand the past from a historical perspective, but they try and understand the future. And yeah, universities, I think, are important institutions in trying to define where we're going in the future. That's from the business sense, that's from the scientific sense, and that should be from the policy sense as well, and I think they're great debates. I think that Charlie Kirk and his university tours were a great part of that. I might not agree with a lot of things that Mr. Kirk had advocated for, but that open discourse at university, that's where we get to the better solution, not from just sitting in our own echo chambers, which is exactly what social media is. Social media just reflects the kind of shit we want to hear, whether or not it's the Yankees are great or DEI is awful. So it's I think universities, yeah, they do have a leftward bent, but I think that comes out of kind of historical analysis. I disagree with the current administration's view of the Smithsonian's, for instance. We need to have a patriotic view of history. It's my grandfather served in World War II, and I'm very effing proud of what he and his generation did for the United States and for the world. My grandfather also grew up in a world that was segregated, in a Jim Crow world. We should be able to accept both of those things and say one thing was great, one thing was not great. Let's fucking reconcile that stuff. I think universities are all part of that. But yeah, do they have a leftward bent, especially in the social histories? Yeah, because I think that those studies tend to be pretty progressive just by definition, But look, like I don't know that I really don't know that Wharton School of Business would be defined as like being a progressive like institution, or that, Columbia Law School necessarily either. It's like, man, they're lawyers, But yeah, I think it'd be crazy to say that, universities are totally like apolitical. Nah, because like I think that university students and university faculty are human beings and they're Americans who are allowed to have political beliefs, and that more people who are progressive end up in university leadership positions. That's not a fucking conspiracy. That means if you want to, if Charlie Kirk if he had lived, could have gone and taught at any university on the planet because he was that kind of a celebrity and he would have been welcome to faculty. If people with more conservative beliefs, want to have them tested, take them to universities is what I would say, just like Charlie Kirk did.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely that type of undertone in universities. I mean, I felt it myself. I went to college in Staten Island, and then I went to the Marines, and I came back to do recruiting so that I could continue college back and forth. And I remember one time I was doing recruiting, so I went to class in uniform, and I got some snarls from the professor at the time, and really kind of anti-military. And that was back then. That was in 2000. Big comparison till now. And yet I felt that undertone then, and we see it even more prevalent now than ever. So we're getting close to 2 hours. I got to thank you so much for coming here today. And I appreciate your stamina in this interview. Some people are going to laugh because I constantly talk about stamina if you're sitting here. So I got to ask you this question, right? Zohran Mamdani was on this podcast. We had a great conversation, but he took off when the conversation started to get a little tough. And I didn't think it was that tough, but all of a sudden he had to leave. So if Zohran Mamdani, who's now considered a socialist, if he gets elected, do you think that's something that could influence or spark or inflame potential political violence in New York City or anywhere in the country right now because he has such a high name recognition? What are your thoughts on that?
Man, that's a really good question, because I think that Mamdani and AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Jamal Bowman, we as a society have elevated some of these folks on the left, just like others have done on the right. We've elevated some of these folks on the left to kind of be like stand-ins for leftist America, the same way we're doing for Mamdani right now. Mamdani has been elected not yet to mayor, and even if he's elected as mayor, yeah, it's the biggest city in the country, but it's just one city in one state. That doesn't mean a whole lot for the national, for the national landscape. But does the election of Mamdani potentially inflame this political divisiveness that we're talking about? And John hit the word perfectly on the head. Yeah, it does, because we are calling him a whole lot of words. Like calling him a socialist just is the same thing as calling Charlie Kirk a fascist. It's like a lot of people using those words don't even necessarily know what they mean, but we're using them to say basically that person's a bad person. So does that inflame the divisiveness? Yeah, it does. By no fault of Mamdani's, I don't believe, because there's other people making him out to be the boogeyman, and then he gets elected, and now all of a sudden it's like we elected the boogeyman. He's not saying I'm the fucking boogeyman. He's saying I'm a candidate for mayor. So yeah, I think it does feed into that divisiveness, unfortunately. I'll stay out of local politics. It's like between Mamdani and Cuomo and Adams, it's like I don't know that any of us have like the perfect candidate to go and pull a lever for on that day, right? But I think that anything we do right now can inflame the divisiveness, because nobody is trying to cool the temperature down. Nobody of relevance. Let me put it that way. From the Democratic side, I think you have people like, I may or may not be a big fan of AOC, but she has at least tried to, in the wake of Charlie's assassination, to say completely unacceptable, it shouldn't be happening. I don't know that we have a whole lot of leaders saying, hey, chill the F out, let's let the democratic process play out. So yeah, like I think that Mamdani will probably win, and I think that it will probably inflame divisiveness right now because nothing is cooling the temperature. I wish I had better things to say on the podcast today, guys, but I think that shit's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I mean, and you know, a lot of the stuff around Mamdani, it's funny because no one knew who the hell he was when he came on this podcast, and I'm like, he's winning the Democratic primary. Like there were people in the chat like, get this bum out of here. He's not. I'm like, this kid's winning the Democratic primary. I'm like, if you're not paying attention, I just like, you know, like he's 100% winning.
Called it, man.
Like, you know, I was like, he's 100% winning, and so, but then when he gets up, like the attention around him and the points around him that people know, I'm like, wait a minute, time out. And I've been talking about this ever since he left, is that there really is no difference in policy between him, Adams, or Cuomo. And yet he's on this stage like he's going to change the Constitution of the United States of America. Business in New York City is going down. And I hear everybody nationally saying it. And I'm like, every single one of his policies, I'm not going to say everyone, but like 99.7% of his policies come directly from Eric Adams' 2021 campaign. And I'm like, world wasn't on fire then. Sky wasn't falling then. You guys voted for him. I wasn't a fan of Adams. I was saying, why the hell are you voting for this guy? I was saying that Adams is a far left progressive, and I don't like him. I don't like him. I think he's full of crap. I think he comes with a lot of corruption around him. I think he never tells the truth about anything. And I think that his policies are very far left and what I consider to be anti-police and pro-criminal. And here's Mamdani coming along, and it's like he sparked a revolution with these thoughts. It's like, oh, city-run grocery stores. I'm like, oh, like the ones you got? Oh, he's going to have free trains and buses. It's like, he probably can't get that done. But basically, if you don't want to pay right now, the trains are free for you. He wants to legalize sex work. He can't do that either. But Eric Adams isn't criminalizing sex work because just take a ride down Roosevelt Avenue. Take a ride in downtown Brooklyn. Go around, drive around, see what you're going to see. You know, and I'm like, what's the difference around him? And the spark on Mamdani, and I see a whole lot of people grifting, campaigning, making money around Mamdani, and really sparking more political rhetoric. And it's not helping things. It's actually making it worse. So I think you're right. I think we're continuing to turn the temperature up. And you already said it. You think things are going to get worse. Do you foresee that we could possibly go back to a 60s, 70s time here in the city?
So a big point that I've been making lately, and I want to make 2 points because you just brought up something really important. A big part of the 60s and 70s in terms of political violence that we haven't seen yet happen has been widespread violence on the streets, riots like what happened in 64 in New York. On the Upper East Side, 15-year-old black child was killed by an off-duty cop. And I don't know the facts of the situation necessarily, but that sparked huge riots throughout New York that spread to Newark, that spread to Philly. You had Watts. You had the nationwide riots in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination that thankfully actually didn't make it to New York because of John Lindsay. I think he gets a lot of credit for that, and I'm going to bring up Lindsay again. But I think that that's a big difference that we haven't had yet. I personally think that my opinion is that the administration's deployment of the National Guard to Democrat-led cities has been actually hoping to provoke something like of a reaction, because National Guard goes out in the streets. I just came back from overseas, and I'm out for a run on the National Mall in DC, just running, by the Capitol and the Washington Monument and the White House. And it just happened to be completely not my fucking plan. Was National Guard was posted there on the mall. And happened to be when the protest was coming by, and it was vocal. Like there were people yelling and screaming at these guardsmen and women, these little kids who got sent there. And all I'm thinking is like, all we need is for one of these protesters to throw a brick, and this turns into a riot, And I was effing scared. I wasn't in uniform, but I was like, I'm gonna get out of here because if this shit goes sideways, I don't want to get rolled up, with this. And I feel like part of that has been intentional in trying to provoke the other side right now, because the administration very much sees it on us and them. It's been trying to provoke the other side to violence, which, exactly like we see in the Charlie Kirk tragedy, it devalues the entire policy, the entire point of view that is underlying there. We haven't gotten back to that widespread violence in the 60s and 70s, like the DNC, the Democratic National Convention in 1968. If the people watching and people listening don't remember it, just Google that shit. It turned into a massive riot outside in the streets of Chicago. Even Walter Cronkite, who was reporting on it live, said that, there's a quote from him, said the DNC will now commence in a police state. This is Walter Cronkite. This is not like lefty progressive journalist or like conservative. This is Walter fucking Cronkite. We haven't gotten back there, and I hope that we don't get there, and I don't think that we will. The other thing I'd say in terms of Mamdani, and you look at like, I think, so it's interesting. I had coffee last week with somebody who is involved in the John Lindsay administration. John Lindsay was mayor in, I think, 65 is when he took over until 70 or 71, whatever it was. And he was the last time, and this person I had coffee with is a dear friend who's like 93 years old now. And he's like, the last time I saw somebody with as much of a groundswell of support as Mamdani has now in New York was John Lindsay, this progressive Republican, like these two words that you can't put together anymore. John Lindsay was a progressive Republican, right? And John Lindsay came into office after Robert Wagner, who was, a Navy man, I'll give him that, or Navy intelligence, actually, and a Democrat. And John Lindsay came in with, promises of cleaning up the police department and the CCRB and, greater focus on like all these highfalutin ideas. And unfortunately, the city just got worse underneath him. Politicians always come into office promising the moon, promising to drain the swamp, promising to lock her up, promising, free healthcare for everyone. They come into office and they get into office and they just do the effing job. And that's all most we could hope for. Like, I don't want to get political. I will say that I thought that Eric Adams was a piece of garbage before he was elected. And Jesus, do I not feel better about him now?
No argument here.
He has not proved any of us wrong, has he? And that's not apolitical. That's just like saying, that's just calling it what it is, But I look, Mamdani, I hope that his supporters don't think he'll actually come in and everyone's rent is going to get chopped in half, and that, everyone's going to have free groceries, and that a cappuccino is going to cost like not $9 a cappuccino, but maybe only $4 a cappuccino. Like, it's just not happening. But and look, this is my, like, as a historian's point of view, it's like you look at John Lindsay, Republican, you look at John McCain, Republican, you look at Barack Obama, Democrat. I mean, I would like to think that I don't vote for party or I don't support party, but I support someone with a moral compass, Like, if you got a moral compass, like, you may not get all the shit done that you want to get done, but you're going to move in the right direction. And I think that people feel like Eric Adams and Cuomo don't have a moral compass that they want to vote for, is all I'll say.
There's a phenomenon that I'm really concerned about, and that's the attack on police officers right now. So I see a similarity in political violence in the 60s and early 70s. The violence we saw is towards police officers from the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army was pretty extensive throughout the entire country. But we also see that now, where police officers are being assaulted and attacked at an alarming rate throughout the entire country, nationwide. Now, in the NYPD specifically, police officers are being assaulted 63% higher than in comparison to 6 years ago, which I think those numbers are astronomical, and it just shows the progression of getting worse. And I think that's all part of political violence. So, and that's a major concern. I'm really concerned about NYPD police officers, especially. We just saw an off-duty police officer robbed in Riverdale. We just seen an off-duty police officer pushed off the train. What are your thoughts about this attack on police officers? Do you think I'm right in my assessment that it's part of political violence, or do you just think it's some type of phenomenon that we're not sure about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's frightening, right? You never want somebody who's going to put on a uniform or to go serve their community to be a target of violence for that, whether in the fire department or whether or not they're grade school teachers or whether they're cops, What I would say is, you mentioned the Black Liberation Army, and for the viewers who don't remember who they are, Black Liberation Army was a very radical offshoot of the Black Panther Party. I would say that the Black Panthers weren't actually, the Panthers themselves and the Panther movement were not violent towards the police. I think that the violence of the Black Panthers is greatly overestimated, mostly by because I mean, J. Edgar Hoover back in the 60s and 70s tried to make the Black Panthers out as being like this invading army. And I think that is unfortunately stuck. That doesn't mean that they didn't spurn off some very radical offshoots. And I talk about this in the book as well. One of them, the most violent, was the Black Liberation Army, which their whole plan was to murder cops, assassinate cops throughout the country in hopes of sparking a race revolution. Black Liberation Army were fucking murderers and terrorists. Let's just call it what it is. Right here in New York, for the listeners who don't remember it, there was, oh man, anyway. In the Lower East Side, right down on 11th Street and Avenue B, in I think it's 72. The Black Liberation Army assassinated two cops, a white cop and a black cop. Yep. Foster and Laurie were their names. Right. I think they were like 23 years old, right? I think both of them were Vietnam vets.
They were.
And both of them were Vietnam vets, a black cop and a white cop patrolling the streets of the Lower East Side together as the Lower East Side was becoming as dangerous as it ever has been in the history of this country. You know, they shot them dead just because of the uniform they were wearing and then danced over their bodies. Man, as disgusting an act as you can ever imagine, you know, and the sign is still up there on the corner. It's like a Foster and Laurie corner or whatever it is, you know, and if you live in the neighborhood, you know, just stop next time you're walking by there and pay respect to those two guys, you know. And what I would say is that the violence against police back then was completely unjustified. It was completely unacceptable. You know, were the police engaging in like violations of civil liberties at the time? Yeah, you know, but go through that the way that they did it with the Handshoe trial, like file a class action lawsuit, take PD to court and rectify it. You know, you don't pull out a gun and start shooting. Like two guys who just got drafted and came back home just wanted to serve their families and their community. You know, I kind of feel the same way now. Are police departments engaging in things that might offend people in those communities? Maybe, maybe not. I actually feel really good about PD these days, to be perfectly honest. But if there's perceived injustice, man, that's what the CCRB is there for. That's something that came out of a Republican administration, that came originally out of John Lindsay's administration. Take it to the CCRB, take it to your council person. You pick up a gun, you've automatically lost the hope that anyone's going to listen to your argument, because all they're doing now is looking at the gun that you picked up. I don't know. I think there was a lot of violence in the 60s and 70s directed towards police officers that was politically motivated. I think that the Black Liberation Army is absolutely the best example of that, or the worst example of that, depending on how you're going to look at it. The Weather Underground also bombed a police station, probably their very first bombing in San Francisco, that resulted in the death of an officer, I believe. And it's not a bombing that's usually attributed to them. But yeah, there was political violence directed at cops in the 1960s and 1970s. In the book, I talk about it, the Panther 13, a couple of the incidents that they were found not guilty of, but they probably actually really did, were taking shots at cops and putting pipe bombs in the gas tank of cop cars. Found not guilty. Not guilty doesn't mean he didn't do it. It just means that jury didn't find you guilty. OJ did it, you know? So yeah, but these days, is there a lot more politically motivated violence against cops? I don't know, is the unfortunate answer. You know, I think you saw the assassination of police officers in Chicago a couple of years ago. Yeah, that was politically motivated, you know? The burning of the police station. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement was overwhelmingly peaceful, and we should celebrate it as such. But did it spawn some acts of unjustifiable violence? Absolutely, including the burning of police stations in Minnesota. Was that politically motivated violence? Yes, it was. Is that going to get worse? Probably.
Yeah, well, as we devolve into more tribalistic society, that's what's happening. we're basically all being used as pawns and no one sees it. Like, we're just a bunch of useful idiots. If you're on the right or you're on the left, consider yourself a useful idiot. If you're all in on a politician, consider yourself a useful idiot. Because
100%.
at the end of the day, all they're doing is they're putting us in a pot, they turn the temperature up, and then we kill each other. And what happens? Oh, they take your rights away. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, to me, I'm like, I really, I don't know where I fall on the political spectrum, but a friend recommended this movie to me the other day. I just started watching it. I didn't finish it. Badge of the Assassin. It's an early James Woods movie, and I forget the black actor's name. David Harris. David Harris is the black actor, and this movie's about the assassination of another two officers, Patrolman Joseph Piagentini and Waverly Jones. This is Piagentini, and they were assassinated also by the Black Liberation Army. So that movie dwells into that court case. James Woods plays he's the district attorney. He's the assistant district attorney that gets handed the case, and he's trying to prosecute their killers. And it's funny because, Eric, when we had oh man, why am I losing his name? The guy who wrote when he was talking about the Black Liberation Army, the guy who wrote why's my brain not working today?
Are you thinking Brian Burrow and
no, I'm talking about the assassination at the mosque.
Of Circle of Six.
Circle of Six. Who's the detective? Randy
Jurgensen.
Randy Jurgensen tells a story how he had to go to San Francisco when he was on the podcast. He had to go to San Francisco to pick up Piagentini and Waverly Jones's killer. And when he went there, New York City was so broke at the time that they had to get money from the San Francisco Police Department, PBA, to fly back to New York City. So this is just another example of how much insanity and terrorism was experienced in New York City during this time. And again, I feel like I unfortunately agree with you, Dave. I think we're headed in a bad direction. I think we're going to see a whole lot more of it. I mean, we don't have all the facts on what happened this morning at the ICE facility. But yeah, let's see what comes out of that. And again, it's just going to be more infighting from different sides with people uninvolved, people who didn't commit the crime. And the temperature is just going to continuously be turned up, and our civil liberties are what's at stake.
Hey guys, I'll just say this, it's like we might vote for different candidates in most elections that come around, but I think that like this kind of a dialogue, between people who can disagree on policy and agree on patriotism, like this is what we need more of. And that's none of the three of us is running for office, so I'll go ahead and say that. But I think that like civil discussions and even civil disagreements, like that's the only way we get out of this. And like the clip you showed of Stephen Miller is not an example of that. Whoever was taking shots at ICE officers today, that's not an example of that. This is an example of that. Sitting and having civil disagreements and civil discussions and crafting a pathway forward. And I don't think that we have a whole lot of that right now, which is why I think that things are going to get worse before they get better. In the 1960s and 1970s, we didn't have like an American, we didn't have an American Gandhi. We didn't have an American Nelson Mandela. We didn't have that like moral force that like led us out of the dark. We don't have that today. So it's kind of like it was up in the 60s and 70s. We either have to wait for the issues that divide us to kind of end, like Vietnam ended and like the civil rights movement ended, or we have to just fucking hold on and weather the storm, because there's nobody right now who's guiding us out of it. And that's the only reason I think that's going to get worse before it gets better. But, keep having these conversations, and hopefully that crafts a path out for us.
Now, I must admit, it's awesome having you here today. I think it's a great conversation, but I have to push back a little bit, and because I partook in operations and the riots that were affected by BLM in the South Bronx, particularly myself, and I saw the violence that was perpetrated by BLM, and from my point of view, it was atrocious. And could understand the comparison to other riots that we see in the past. But for my era, seeing the amount of violence that was pushed from BLM, the hatred and the amount of orchestrated togetherness I saw from BLM, and the amount of hatred and the legitimate violence that was there was atrocious. And the lack of support that the police department got along with that made it even worse, because I lost 20 vacation days for partaking in the riot just for doing my job, just seeing the pressure from the Civilian Complaint Review Board. I mean, I think that's a conversation for another day, but it was atrocious. And but again, I respect your opinion. So with that being said, I just want to say, you have so many accolades. You got a book, you're a professor, and you're so articulate, and you're willing to have conversations, like you said, where they're agreed upon or not. Is there anything in your book or anything today that you have not mentioned that you would like to disclose to the public? This is your day. So if there's anything that you want to disclose, we appreciate it. Anything that may not be in your book or anything that we didn't discuss today.
No, I'll let we can wrap it up even by just saying this, is that I think that what we've all talked about, and not just me fucking pontificating here, but just like I love this conversation. I'd love to continue it sometimes on Black Lives Matter and all those other things whenever you guys want to do so, and even talk specifically about riots and when protest turns to riot even. But the only thing I would like in closing that I would say is that, look, I wrote a book of history, expecting it to be a piece of history, and I really hate that it is right now kind of current events. The bombings have not started like they did in the 1960s and 1970s. I hate to make shitty predictions, but I think that is next. It's too easy to get on the dark web and pull down some bomb designs. It's too easy to go out and buy some components for homemade explosives that I'm not going to talk about, that we all know by name and probably by composition. And it's too easy to get on a front page with your movement by just taking a pipe bomb, putting a note on it, and putting it under a National Guard truck, or putting it under an ICE truck, or putting it under putting it in a university protest or whatever it is. So the last thing I would say is that I fear that the bombs might be next, and I very much hope that I am proven wrong, is the last thing I would say.
Oh, yeah. I hope you're wrong, too. And just to update on this, Joel Ramirez just brought it up. Dallas ICE facility shooting kills at least 2 detainees. So a little, I think we reported a little different earlier. So it's actually detainees that were shot, sniper found dead on the roof. So obviously this is going to be looked at as right-wing violence, right? Just based upon that, if that holds to be true. One last question for you. I meant to ask you earlier. I forgot it. Sorry to hold you. I know we've been going a while, but last question for you. We had spoken offline, and you, prior to Charlie Kirk being assassinated, you had wrote an article and in substance saying that it started with a sandwich. And it was based around the ICE facilities, right? Where if you guys and girls remember, there was I forget where he worked. Maybe the guy worked at the Department of State. I forget. He worked for the government, and he had a sandwich, and he threw the sandwich off an ICE officer. And you said something in substance like it could easily go from a sandwich to a Molotov cocktail. Could you just explain your thought and why you said that?
Yeah, thanks, John. So for the audience, what it is that and it's a fucking hilarious video. You can watch it on YouTube. In DC, when Trump deployed the National Guard to DC, an Air Force veteran who'd served in Afghanistan, who works at DOJ, was just really physically angry. And they just bought his Subway sandwich. He's yelling at these ICE officers. I think it's actually a CBP officer, and literally launches his sandwich into this chest of this fully kitted officer, right? And then just takes off running down U Street, which is just hilarious, But that was his form of protest, right? It was violent, throwing a sandwich at a officer is, violence, but it's also kind of fucking hilarious, right? And I mean, Banksy inspired artwork about this guy started popping up all over the city. You can Google it if just Google Banksy sandwich, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And people started wearing T-shirts of this guy's of the Banksy artwork. And the case that I was making was that, hey, listen, like this is protest. This is violent, but it's also kind of hilarious, and it's like absurd, and it's kind of an absurd response to the absurd justification that the administration is making for putting National Guard on the streets. I was like, but be careful. It's like, and I didn't want to be alarmist, but I was like, a sandwich can turn into a firecracker, can turn into a Molotov cocktail, can turn into a sniper's bullet. And I literally submitted the story about 2 hours before Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And I thought I was being alarmist when I wrote the story. And I was like, well, that jumped over my entire story. It jumped over everything I had just said. And now it's like the worst case alarmist thing I was saying might come to pass came to pass before it even got published, and I think that cooler heads may have a chance to prevail. Stephen Miller is not one of those cooler heads, but hopefully this doesn't incite something bigger is the only thing I would say. But man, if protest does turn into bombs, we are all effed is the only thing I would say. The left is effed, the right is effed, Americans are screwed. So I'm just hoping that we let the shooting of Charlie Kirk be an anomaly by somebody who will be held accountable by law, not inspiration to do similar kinds of violent activities.
Dr. David Viola, I appreciate your appearance today. Awesome interview. You're very articulate in your responses and very honest, and I appreciate it. Awesome interview. Your accolades are super impressive. So with that being said, we learned about all your accolades. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, like have a little fun here. Tell us what you're into, hobbies, what you do for fun, things that we don't know about, and then give us your last words for today. Thank you so much. Thanks for the chat today. Great engagement. Defiance Unfiltered. Dr. Viola, let's hear from you.
No, thank you guys again. And the last thing I'm a big runner, a big fan of the New York City Marathon. So I'll be out there again this year. So if I offended anyone, just look for me, follow me on the run tracker, and then just throw shit at me, and I'll know it's somebody I offended on this podcast.
Throw a sandwich at you.
Man, if anyone throws a sandwich at me, I will applaud. I'll find that hilarious. It just means I'm going to run a whole lot faster. I actually think that my next book is going to be on the New York City Marathon because I want to live a little bit outside the space of political violence for a little while, but hey, man, like you guys and like a lot of people listening, I'm a New Yorker through and through. Just spent a year overseas serving our country, and I'm an American, but I'm kind of a New Yorker first, kind of the same way a lot of Texans feel like they're Texans first and Americans second. I feel like I'm a New Yorker first, So showing the video of this dude running down man, it's just fucking hilarious. But
that's gonna be you.
That's gonna be me at the marathon,
Rob Lukash, he's part of the Defiance Unfiltered family. He does a show actually tonight. You get a chance to go to the Executive Perspective. He wants to know what kind of sandwich you like.
A soft one, nothing.
A soft
one. That's it, guys. Listen, I mean it, and I've said it to you, John. I'm saying it to you, Eric. Thank you guys for everything you do. Thank you guys for keeping the conversation going. It's been a pleasure being here with you guys, and I hope to talk with you guys in the audience again.
Yeah, no, appreciate you coming on, brother. All right, people, check out the Executive Perspective. I'm going to get the time right today. It's going to be at 17:05 or 5:05 p.m. Eastern time. And they're going to be
John,
getting
that's the time last time.
Yeah.
And please buy a book so I can pay my rent. And please buy a book so I can pay my rent.
Support Dave. Support Dave. Oh, well, Stephen S. gave you a great suggestion, too, and we didn't highlight that here. He wants to do New York City Terrorism Tour with Dr. David. That's it. I mean, we'll just take 5% of every referral.
No, I honestly want to do that. I'm going to say one more thing, then I'm going to leave. Then I'm going to I'm going to walk away. I have a friend who won't mention my name.
Walk away.
A friend of mine who is this is a number of years ago. This person worked at CIA, detailed from CIA to NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, right? So knows a effing lot about terrorism. And she was visiting me in New York, and we're walking around the village, and I pointed out to her the Weather Underground townhouse, and she's like, I never fucking heard of this. And I start walking around the neighborhood, just pointing shit out to her, and she actually mentioned the same thing, There's a lot to be talked about, but you have to go directly from that walking tour to the bar to be like, fuck, that was unhappy. Go to McSorley's, where Sam Melville, noted American leftist, his last drink before he got arrested by undercovers for blowing up a bunch of stuff in Antifa.
Really? McSorley's.
Last beer he had as a free man, and then he died a year and a half after he got arrested at the riots at Attica. So next time you're at McSorley's, you're having a drink in the same spot Sam Melville had his last drink before he. Again, talk about it in the book. Go and read a book. I'm gonna stop telling you.
You're gonna make me look at New York City different now, because when I go back, I'm gonna look around like, was there a bomb here? Dave, what happened here?
Hey, listen, guys, thank you again, and thanks again for the audience, and we'll definitely be in touch.
All right, guys. Take care. Everybody, find us Unfiltered. Check out Executive's Perspective tonight. They're going to be talking about NYPD, the rise in death in custody, amongst other topics. So check them out tonight. Talk to you guys later.
That's right.
There's a handful of retired officers that don't live in the state that have a lot to say about the dream team, as I like to call it. All of a sudden, they retire and have a master plan on how to fight crime, but nothing to contribute when they were here. They want to come back and be part of the dream team. What can I say?
Law enforcement professionals dedicate their lives to serving and protecting our community. But who's protecting their financial futures? That's where Laidlaw Blue comes in. Our wealth management platform is specifically designed for the law enforcement community. Laidlaw Blue is a division within Laidlaw Wealth Management, run by retired New York City detective John McDermott. His status as a retired detective uniquely positions him to establish a deep connection between Laidlaw Blue and the law enforcement community. Our platform is easy to use and provides a range of financial services, including investment management, retirement planning, and insurance solutions. With Laidlaw Blue, you can secure your financial future and provide for your loved ones. Our team of experienced financial advisors understands the unique challenges and opportunities that law enforcement professionals face. We're here to help you navigate the complexities of financial planning and achieve your goals. Laidlaw Blue. Secure your financial future today. Book a meeting using the QR code displayed or call us directly on 888 901 Blue. That's 888 901 Blue.